Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more Nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain arrived first that afternoon, gentle and persistent, tapping against the windows of 221B Baker Street, with the patience of an old friend who knows you'll eventually answer the door. Inside, the sitting room had settled into that particular quality of autumn drowsiness that London does so well. When the light turns amber and thick, when sounds seem to travel through honey, when even the dust motes appear to drift more slowly through the air. The fire in the grate whispered and crackled, speaking its own language of comfort, while the coal shifted with soft sighs that punctuated the rhythm of the rain. Sherlock Holmes occupied his usual chair with the languid grace of a cat who has found the perfect patch of sunlight, though in this case it was firelight that painted golden patterns across his aquiline features. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes half closed, in that state between thought and reverie that Watson had learned to recognize as either profound contemplation or absolute boredom, the two conditions being, in Holmes's particular constitution, remarkably similar in appearance. A cup of tea sat cooling on the small table at his elbow, forgotten the moment its warmth had ceased to be a novelty worth attending to. Dr. John Watson, for his part, had claimed the other chair with the contentment of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be, and was grateful for it. His medical journal lay open across his knee, though he'd read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word about the latest advances in antiseptic technique. The afternoon had that quality, that soft, blurred quality, where concentration became a thing to be pursued rather than captured. Outside, London carried on its business with muffled determination, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on wet cobblestones arriving as a distant percussion, the occasional call of a street vendor drifting up like a message from another world entirely. The room itself breathed history and habit in equal measure. Books lined the walls with the comfortable disorder of a library that had long ago given up any pretense of organization, their spines bearing the scars and fading of frequent consultation. Papers sprawled across the desk in what appeared to be chaos, but which Holmes would insist, if pressed, represented a filing system of exquisite precision understood only by its creator. The Persian slipper that served as tobacco storage drooped from the mantelpiece like a question mark, while the violin rested in its case near the window, temporarily silent, but somehow still present in the room's atmosphere, as though the music it might make lingered always, just beneath the threshold of hearing. Mrs. Hudson had been up earlier with fresh scones, her attempt, Watson suspected, to counteract what she persisted in calling the bachelor tendency toward melancholy on wet afternoons. The scones sat on a plate between the two men, still faintly warm, their current count reduced by exactly half. The butter had been applied with Watson's characteristic military precision. Holmes had eaten his plain, barely tasting them, the consumption of food being for him more a maintenance procedure than a pleasure. It was, in short, a perfect afternoon for absolutely nothing to happen. the city beyond the window had other ideas. Victorian London in October was a creature of contradictions, a vast organism that pulsed with industry and indolence, ambition and resignation. The rain that fell on Baker Street fell equally on Whitechapel and Mayfair, on the gleaming new underground stations and the ancient stones of the Tower, on the desperate and the comfortable alike. In 1895, the Empire sprawled across the globe with the confident reach of a power that couldn't yet imagine its own decline. But here, in the heart of it all, the city remained stubbornly particular about its own rhythms. Afternoon tea was a sacred ritual. Traffic observed unspoken hierarchies of precedence. And gentlemen, proper gentlemen, wore proper hats. The importance of a hat in Victorian society cannot be overstated to modern sensibilities. A man's hat announced his station before he ever opened his mouth. A top hat for formal occasions, a bowler for business, a deerstalker for the country. Each had its place, its purpose, its unspoken grammar in the language of respectability. To lose one's hat was not merely inconvenient. It was a small social catastrophe, a breach in the armour of civilization that every proper Englishman maintained against the chaos of existence. Which is why, when Mycroft Holmes arrived at precisely 3:30 that afternoon, his appearance caused Watson to sit up sharply enough to send his medical journal sliding to the floor. Mycroft Holmes did not run. Mycroft Holmes did not hurry. Mycroft Holmes moved through the world with the measured deliberation of a man who had calculated the precise energy expenditure required for any given journey, and would not waste a single erg more than necessary. His usual mode of arrival at his brother's lodgings involved a careful ascent of the stairs, a measured knock, and an entrance that suggested he had been there all along, and was merely making his presence official. This afternoon, however, Mycroft Holmes arrived like a storm system in a frock coat. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs, rapid, heavy, uncharacteristically urgent, reached them before he did. Watson had time to exchange a glance with Sherlock, whose eyebrows had risen with interest for the first time in hours. Then the door burst open with such force that even Mrs. Hudson, who had been following in Mycroft's considerable wake with expressions of concern and offers of tea, fell silent in the face of such unprecedented disruption. Mycroft Holmes stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, actually breathing heavily, which for a man who rationed even his respiration was tantamount to emotional collapse. His face, usually the colour of parchment, kept carefully away from sunlight, had flushed to an alarming shade of pink. His collar appeared to have somehow grown tighter, and his head was bare. No hat. Mycroft Holmes, that pillar of governmental discretion, that embodiment of civil service dignity, that man who represented the British government in all but official title, stood before them without a hat. "It's gone," Mycroft announced, his voice carrying the kind of outrage usually reserved for declarations of war. "Stolen, vanished, taken from under their very noses." Sherlock unfolded himself from his chair with feline grace, the drowsiness falling away like a discarded coat. "My dear Mycroft," he said, and Watson could hear the barely suppressed delight in his voice. "Do sit down before you have an apoplexy. Mrs. Hudson, tea, I think, and perhaps something stronger. Watson, close your mouth. You look like a landed fish. Now, brother mine, from the beginning, and do try to maintain some semblance of coherence." Mycroft collapsed into the nearest chair. Another unprecedented event. Mycroft never collapsed, and accepted the tea that Mrs. Hudson pressed into his hands with the efficiency of a woman who had dealt with agitated visitors before, though perhaps never agitated visitors of quite this caliber. He gulped it down with no regard whatsoever for temperature or taste, then set the cup down with a sharp click against the saucer. "The Diogenes Club," he said, as though this explained everything. "Yes?" Sherlock prompted, settling back into his chair, but now fully alert, his grey eyes bright with the hunter's focus that Watson knew preceded his finest work. "My hat," Mycroft continued. "My bowler, the grey one with the Petersham ribbon. I left it, as I always do, in the cloakroom when I arrived this morning for my customary Thursday session in the second-floor reading room. 3 hours, Sherlock. 3 hours of complete silence and civilized contemplation. I emerged at 2:30, descended to the cloakroom, and found—" He paused, struggling with the enormity of it. "I found a different hat." Watson leaned forward. "A different hat? But surely not my hat," Mycroft said with finality. "Similar, yes. The same style, the same colour at first glance. But not mine. The band is slightly more worn. The brim curves differently, and it lacks entirely the small repair on the inner band, where my own hat was mended last March after an unfortunate encounter with a cab door." Sherlock had begun to smile, that particular smile that Watson recognized as the prelude to either brilliant insight or brotherly torment, possibly both. "So someone," he said slowly, "went to the trouble of bringing an almost identical hat to the Diogenes Club and switching it for yours. Not stealing it outright, mind you, but switching it. That suggests intention rather than opportunistic theft." "Obviously," Mycroft snapped, some of his usual acerbity returning now that the initial shock was wearing off. "I am not here because I misplaced my hat like some absent-minded academic. I am here because someone deliberately took it, left a substitute, and did so in an establishment where such things simply do not happen. The Diogenes Club has standards." The Diogenes Club, indeed, had standards. Founded for men who preferred silence and solitude, even while seeking the company of others, a very English sort of contradiction. It maintained an atmosphere of such rigorous quiet that members who spoke above a whisper in any room save the stranger's room faced immediate expulsion. It was the perfect establishment for men like Mycroft Holmes, who valued privacy, discretion, and the absence of social obligation. That anything untoward should occur in such a bastion of respectability suggested either tremendous daring or tremendous necessity. Watson cleared his throat. "Forgive me, Mycroft, but could it simply be a mistake? Another member taking the wrong hat by accident?" Mycroft turned to look at him with the expression of a man forced to explain basic arithmetic to a particularly slow child. "Dr. Watson, the members of the Diogenes Club are, by definition, men of precise habits and keen observation. We do not make mistakes about our own belongings. Furthermore, I checked the attendance register. Only 7 members were present today, and I know each of their hats by sight. None of them wear a bowler of this particular style." "Visitors?" Sherlock suggested. "No visitors were admitted today." "Staff?" "The staff at the Diogenes Club have been with the establishment for an average of 23 years each. They know every member's hat as well as their own family. If anything, they're more reliable than the members themselves." The fire crackled thoughtfully, as though considering this puzzle. Outside, the rain had intensified slightly, drumming a more insistent rhythm against the window. A hansom cab passed below, its wheels hissing through puddles, and somewhere distant, a church bell chimed the quarter hour. Sherlock rose from his chair and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his head slightly bowed in the posture of concentration that Watson had seen 100 times before. "Tell me about the substitute hat," he said. "Every detail." Mycroft reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a small notebook, which Watson realized he must have been carrying all along. Even in distress, Mycroft Holmes took notes. "Bowler hat, grey felt, Petersham band in black, manufactured by Lock and Cobuster, though not the same Lock & Co. where I purchase my own hats. The label is present, but the serial number has been deliberately obscured. Age, approximately 2 years, based on wear patterns. Previous owner, right-handed, walks with a slight limp, favouring the left leg, occasionally grasps the brim with thumb and forefinger while thinking, and has a tendency to remove the hat in warm environments, suggesting either a warm constitution or an occupation that requires frequent transition between outdoor and indoor settings." "My dear Mycroft," Sherlock said, genuine admiration warming his voice, "you have not entirely wasted your powers on the minutiae of government administration." "It's not my hat," Mycroft replied, as though this were the only fact that mattered, which, perhaps, to him, it was. Watson found himself pulled into the puzzle, despite its apparent absurdity. A missing hat. A switched hat. In the grand scheme of international affairs and criminal enterprises that occasionally darkened their door, it seemed almost laughably trivial. And yet, there was something here, wasn't there? Something that didn't quite fit, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise harmonious melody. "Why would someone switch hats rather than simply steal yours?" he asked aloud. Sherlock stopped pacing and turned to face him. That expression of pleased surprise that Watson had learned meant he'd asked precisely the right question. "Exactly, Watson, exactly. If the goal was simple theft, if someone desired a hat and took one opportunistically, they would simply take it and leave nothing behind. But to go to the trouble of providing a substitute, and not just any substitute, but a nearly identical one, suggests that the thief wanted the theft to go unnoticed, at least initially. They wanted Mycroft to leave the club with a hat, any hat, and not immediately raise the alarm." "But why?" Watson pressed. "That," Sherlock said, his eyes alight with the thrill of a new puzzle, "is what we are going to discover. Mycroft, I assume you want your hat back." "I want to know why someone wanted it in the first place," Mycroft corrected. "The hat itself is replaceable, though I had grown rather attached to it. But the principle of the thing, Sherlock, the audacity of it, the implications." "The implications," Sherlock repeated softly, and Watson saw something shift in his expression, a sharpening of focus that suggested he was seeing connections that had not yet revealed themselves to his companions. "Yes, the implications. Tell me, Mycroft, have you carried anything unusual in that hat recently? Any documents in the lining, perhaps? Any small items tucked into the band?" Mycroft's face went very still, which was as good as a confession from a man usually so animated in his affirmations or denials. "Nothing of importance," he said, but his voice had gone carefully neutral in a way that suggested the exact opposite. The rain continued its soft percussion against the windows. The fire settled lower in the grate, And in the warm, comfortable sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the afternoon's drowsy peace had transformed into something sharper, something that tasted of mystery and possibility. Watson looked from one brother to the other, Mycroft still flushed and agitated in his chair, Sherlock standing alert and focused by the window, and felt that familiar stirring of anticipation that came before their best adventures. Even if this one began with nothing more dramatic than a missing hat. Sometimes, he reflected, the smallest mysteries contained the largest secrets. Sometimes a hat was not merely a hat. Sometimes the trivial became tremendous when you looked at it closely enough. And sometimes, on rainy Thursday afternoons in London, when the Empire sprawled vast and unknowable beyond the window, and the world turned on wheels within wheels, the disappearance of a single grey bowler from a gentleman's club could be the thread that, when pulled, unravelled something far larger than anyone had anticipated. Sherlock Holmes smiled. "Well then," he said, reaching for his own hat, "a deerstalker, naturally, because if one must investigate a missing hat, one should do so while properly hatted oneself. I believe we have a case." The journey from Baker Street to Pall Mall was not a long one, but it carried the traveller through several distinct strata of London society, each with its own particular character, its own rhythm and reason. The cab that bore Holmes, Watson, and the still agitated Mycroft moved through streets that transformed as they passed, from the comfortable respectability of Baker Street, through the commercial bustle of Oxford Street, and finally into the hushed grandeur of Clubland, where power whispered behind Portland stone facades and fortunes were made or lost over port and cigars. The rain had settled into that steady, determined fall that suggested it had no intention of stopping any time soon, turning the city into a watercolour of greys and browns, blurring the edges of buildings and softening the harsh lines of Victorian progress. Water ran in the gutters with a sound like distant conversation, carrying with it the detritus of the day, scraps of paper, fallen leaves from the plane trees that lined the better streets, the occasional lost glove or handkerchief that would never find its way home. The gas lamps were being lit early, their glow creating small islands of amber warmth in the gathering dusk, and the lamplighters moved from post to post with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed the same task for so many years that it had become a kind of meditation. Inside the cab, Mycroft had regained some measure of his usual composure, though Watson noticed he kept touching the crown of his borrowed hat, a temporary replacement from Holmes' collection, as though to reassure himself it was still there. The substitute hat that had been left in place of his own rested on his knee, and occasionally Sherlock would reach across to examine it again, turning it in his hands with the delicate attention a jeweller might give to a suspicious diamond. "The wear pattern on the inner band," Sherlock murmured, more to himself than to his companions, "suggests the wearer has a larger head circumference than the hat strictly accommodates. See here, Watson, how the leather has compressed in these specific areas. Regular discomfort, regularly endured. A man who wears the wrong size hat is either careless about his appearance, which the quality of the hat itself contradicts, or he acquired it second-hand and had no choice in the sizing." Watson leaned in to examine the indicated areas, though to his untrained eye they looked like nothing more than the general wear any hat might accumulate. Second-hand, then. Possibly. Or borrowed for a specific purpose. The The question is whether the purpose was the wearing of the hat, or the switching of it. Sherlock set the hat aside and gazed out at the passing streets, his fingers drumming a thoughtful pattern on his knee. Mycroft, I want you to think very carefully about the past week. Has anything unusual occurred? Any changes in routine, unexpected visitors, conversations that struck you as odd, even in passing? Mycroft's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. For a man whose mind was said to be the filing cabinet of the British government, the exercise should have been simple, but Watson could see the difficulty he faced. When everything is significant, how does one determine what is unusually significant? There was. No, that's nothing. Well, perhaps. Last Tuesday, a courier from the Foreign Office delivered a packet of documents. Nothing extraordinary in that. They arrive regularly. But he seemed nervous, distracted. Asked twice for the cloakroom location, though he'd been to the club before. Which courier? Sherlock's voice had gone sharp with interest. Jenkins. Martin Jenkins. Young fellow. Been with the Foreign Office for perhaps 3 years. Good family. Decent record. No particular distinction, but no black marks either. And he was in the club last Tuesday, you say? What time? Mid-morning. I remember because he arrived during the quiet period between breakfast and lunch, when the reading rooms are most deserted. The cab turned onto Pall Mall, that street of privilege and power, where Britain's elite congregated in their various establishments, the Reform Club, the Athenaeum, the Carlton, and, most secretive of them all, the Diogenes. These were the places where the real business of empire occurred, where decisions made over brandy would ripple out to affect millions who would never know the names of the men who made them. The buildings rose like temples to each particularly English god, the god of restraint, of propriety, of knowing one's place and keeping to it with absolute conviction. The Diogenes Club itself was perhaps the most austere of all these establishments, its facade so deliberately unremarkable that one might pass it without notice, which was rather the point. Where other clubs announced themselves with polished brass and doormen in livery, the Diogenes maintained an entrance that might have belonged to a prosperous but not ostentatious private residence. The only indication of its purpose was a small brass plate beside the door, worn smooth by weather and time, bearing nothing more than the club's name and the date of its founding, 1842. They alighted from the cab into the rain, which had intensified just enough to be inconvenient, without being dramatic. Mycroft led the way with the determination of a man returning to the scene of a crime, which, in his view, it certainly was. The door was opened before they reached it by a porter, whose face suggested he had been carved from the same stone as the building itself, all weathered dignity and imperturbable composure. "Mr. Holmes," the porter said, nodding to Mycroft with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "And guests, Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, I presume? You are expected. Mr. Stamford has been informed of your arrival." Inside, the Diogenes Club revealed itself as a temple to silence and solitude. The entrance hall was panelled in dark wood that absorbed sound like a sponge, the floor covered in Turkish carpets so thick that footsteps became whispers, the walls hung with portraits of distinguished members long dead, their painted eyes seeming to enforce the rule of quiet, even from beyond the grave. Gas lamps burned in wall sconces, their light kept deliberately low, creating an atmosphere that was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, but simply present. like the club itself, had achieved a state of being that transcended ordinary social considerations. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner with a sound like a heartbeat, slow and steady. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked as some unseen member made his way from one sanctuary of silence to another. The smell of the place was distinctive: leather and pipe tobacco, old books and older money, the particular scent of a building that had witnessed decades of the same rituals performed by different men who nonetheless were all fundamentally the same. Mr. Stamford, the club's secretary, materialized from a side corridor with the discretion of a man who had learned to move through spaces without disturbing them. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that suggested he had seen everything the world had to offer, and found most of it mildly disappointing, but not particularly surprising. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his expression conveyed profound regret that anything so vulgar as a theft had occurred within his jurisdiction. "Mr. Holmes," he said to Mycroft, his voice barely above a whisper, not from any need for secrecy, but because in the Diogenes Club, whispers were simply the loudest acceptable volume. "A most distressing situation, most distressing indeed. In 43 years of service, I have never, that is to say, the reputation of the establishment." He trailed off, unable to find words adequate to express his dismay. "We quite understand," Sherlock said smoothly, taking command of the situation with the ease of a man accustomed to navigating delicate social situations. "I wonder if we might examine the cloakroom and speak with whoever was manning it this afternoon." Stamford nodded, relief evident that someone was taking charge. Of course. Young Perkins was on duty. Excellent boy, been with us 2 years, quite reliable. He's most upset about the entire affair, naturally. This way, if you please." They followed him deeper into the building, through corridors that seemed designed to muffle not just sound, but time itself, as though the club existed in some pocket dimension where the modern world could not quite reach. The walls were lined with bookcases containing volumes that looked as though they had not been disturbed in decades, collections of parliamentary proceedings, bound copies of the Times going back to the newspaper's founding, memoirs of colonial administrators whose names meant nothing to anyone born after 1870. This was history, as preservation rather than progress, the past kept carefully separate from the present, like valuable china wrapped in cloth. The cloakroom was located near the rear entrance, a modest space lined with hooks and cubbies, each carefully labelled with the names or membership numbers of the club's patrons. It smelled of damp wool and leather, with an undertone of the various pomades and colognes that gentlemen applied to maintain their dignity against London's persistent assault of coal smoke and grime. A small desk occupied one corner, currently manned by a young man who looked as though he wished very much to be anywhere else in the world. Perkins was perhaps 22, with the kind of eager, anxious face that suggested he had not yet learned to hide his emotions behind the mask of professional discretion that would come with years of service. His uniform was neat, his posture correct, but his hands trembled slightly as he stood upon their entrance, and Watson found himself feeling rather sorry for the boy. Whatever had happened, it clearly hadn't been his fault, and yet he would carry the shame of it regardless. "Mr. Perkins," Stamford said with the gentleness of a headmaster addressing a student who has disappointed rather than angered him. These gentlemen are here about this afternoon's incident. Please answer their questions fully and honestly." "Yes, sir," Perkins said, his voice breaking slightly on the second word. "I'm terribly sorry, sir. I don't know how it could have happened. I never left my post, not once. I'm always so careful." Sherlock held up a hand, stemming the flow of apology. "I'm sure you are, Mr. Perkins. Now tell me about this afternoon, from the beginning, if you please. What time did Mr. Mycroft Holmes arrive?" Perkins consulted a ledger on his desk, though Watson suspected he knew the information by heart. 10 o'clock precisely, sir. Mr. Mycroft Holmes is always punctual. I took his hat, coat, and umbrella, and placed them in his usual cubby, number 47. He went upstairs to the reading room, as is his custom on Thursdays. And during the time he was upstairs, who else came and went? The boy's forehead creased with concentration. "Let me think, sir. Mr. Ashworth arrived at 10:30. He's a barrister, sir. Comes in to read the legal journals. Then Mr. Pemberton at 11. He's Foreign Office like. Well, Mr. Harrison came in just before noon, and there was a visitor, sir, with credentials from Whitehall just after noon. A courier, he said, with a delivery for Mr. Mycroft Holmes." Mycroft's head snapped up. "A delivery? I received no delivery." "No, sir," Perkins said miserably, "because when I sent word up to you, the courier said he'd made a mistake, that the delivery was actually for Mr. Pemberton, not you. So I directed him to Mr. Pemberton's usual location in the library, and he went up. He wasn't gone more than 10 minutes before he came back down and left, very apologetic about the confusion." "Describe this courier," Sherlock demanded, his voice sharp with the scent of revelation. "Well, sir, he was ordinary, really. Medium height, medium build, dark coat, proper hat. A bowler, I think. Yes, definitely a bowler. Clean-shaven, brown hair, perhaps 30 years old. Nothing particularly distinctive about him, except—" Perkins paused, chewing his lip. "Except?" Watson prompted gently. "He seemed nervous, sir. Kept looking around, as though he expected someone to challenge him. And his coat. Now that I think about it, it was wet, but not as wet as it should have been, given how hard it was raining at noon, as though he'd only just come from somewhere close by, or had been waiting under shelter for some time." Sherlock turned to examine the cubbies, his eyes scanning the rows of hooks and shelves with systematic precision. "And you're certain you never left your post? Not even for a moment?" "Well," Perkins coloured, "there was one moment, sir. When the courier came back down, Mr. Ashworth called me over to help him with his umbrella. The catch had stuck, and he was having trouble opening it. I was only away from the desk for perhaps 30 seconds, but the courier had already left by then. I'm certain of it. I saw him go out the door before I went to help Mr. Ashworth." "Or someone who looked like the courier," Sherlock murmured. He turned back to the boy. "Think carefully, Mr. Perkins. When the courier left, when you saw him leave, are you absolutely certain it was the same man who had arrived?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Perkins' face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, concentration, and then dawning horror. I assumed it was, sir. He was wearing the same sort of coat, the same hat, but I didn't see his face clearly, not when he was leaving. He had his back to me, and then he was gone, and I went to help Mr. Ashworth, and when I came back—" He gestured helplessly at the cubbies. Watson found himself reconstructing the scene in his mind. A courier arrives, asks for Mycroft, is told Mycroft is upstairs, claims to have the wrong recipient, goes upstairs anyway, ostensibly to find Pemberton, but actually to... what? Scope out the building? Confirm Mycroft's location? Meanwhile, an accomplice enters, or the courier himself returns by another route, and in those 30 seconds, while Perkins is distracted with the umbrella, makes the switch. Quick, simple, elegant. It required only minimal planning and 2 pieces of good fortune, that Perkins would be called away and that the Cubbies were unobserved for those crucial seconds. But why? Sherlock had moved to Mycroft's cubby and was examining it with minute attention, running his fingers along the edges, peering into corners, even lying flat on the floor at one point to examine the underside of the shelf from below. Stamford watched with barely concealed alarm, as though concerned that one of England's most famous detectives was about to damage the club's property. But he said nothing. Finally, Sherlock stood, brushing dust from his coat with an expression of satisfaction. "Nothing here," he announced. "Whatever they wanted, it was in the hat itself, not hidden near it. Mycroft, we need to speak with this courier Jenkins, and we need to do so immediately. Mr. Stamford, I don't suppose you keep records of visitors' addresses?" "Only for members, sir. Visitors with proper credentials from government offices are admitted on the authority of their departments." "Of course they are." Sherlock turned to his brother. "Mycroft?" Mycroft had been standing very still throughout the interview, his face expressionless, in a way that Watson had learned meant he was thinking furiously, connecting pieces of information in that vast mind of his, seeing patterns that existed only in the intersection of 1,000 different data points. Now he stirred, as though waking from a trance. "Jenkins lives in Bloomsbury," he said quietly. "I have his address in my files. But Sherlock, if he was involved in this, if he used his position to facilitate a theft from me specifically, the implications are rather more serious than a missing hat." "I know," Sherlock said. "That's what makes it interesting." They thanked Perkins, who looked marginally less terrified than when they'd arrived, though still thoroughly miserable, and Stamford, who showed them out with the mournful dignity of a man watching his life's work undermined by forces beyond his control. The rain greeted them like an old acquaintance, and they stood for a moment under the small portico, while Mycroft hailed another cab. Watson found himself looking up and down Pall Mall, at the other clubs with their lit windows, at the few pedestrians hurrying through the rain, at the evening settling over London like a blanket over a sleeping child. Somewhere in this vast city, someone had Mycroft's hat, and that someone, Watson was increasingly certain, had taken it for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with fashion. "The courier returns," Sherlock said softly, almost to himself. "The courier returns, Watson, but does the hat stay with him? Or does it move again? If I wanted to steal a hat from Mycroft Holmes, I would not keep it on my person. Too dangerous. No, I would pass it along, quickly and cleanly, to whoever actually wanted it." "Then we may be too late," Watson said. "Perhaps, but I think not. Whoever orchestrated this went to considerable trouble to make the theft appear to be a simple mix-up, something that might not be discovered for hours, even days. They would not have expected Mycroft to notice immediately. That buys us time." A cab pulled up, and they climbed in, shaking rain from their coats. As they pulled away from the Diogenes Club, Watson looked back at its discreet facade, at the small brass plate being slowly obscured by the gathering dusk. A temple to silence and secrets, he thought. How appropriate that it should be the scene of this particular crime. "Mycroft," Sherlock said as the cab rattled toward Bloomsbury, "what was in your hat?" There was a long pause. The rain drummed on the cab's roof. London slid past the windows, all blurred lights and shadowed buildings. "Nothing," Mycroft said finally. "And that, dear brother, is precisely what worries me. Because if there was nothing in my hat worth stealing, then the hat itself must have been the message." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp. A message, he thought. But a message to whom, and saying what? The cab carried them through the darkening streets, and somewhere ahead, a courier named Jenkins waited, unknowing, for questions he might not want to answer. Bloomsbury in the evening had a character entirely its own, distinct from the hushed grandeur of Pall Mall or the comfortable respectability of Baker Street. Here, the city revealed a different face, still respectable, certainly, but with the threadbare gentility of scholars and clerks, of people who valued books more than silver and ideas more than inheritance. The British Museum brooded at its heart like a great stone repository of everything humanity had ever thought worth preserving, and around it clustered boarding houses, modest flats, and the occasional rooms let to students who dreamed of making their names in literature or law or the civil service. The rain had eased to a fine mist that hung in the air rather than falling through it, turning the gas lamps into soft halos of golden light that seemed to float suspended in the gathering dark. The streets here were narrower than in the West End, the buildings pressed closer together as though huddling for warmth, and the sounds were different too. Less the clatter of wealth and commerce, more the quiet murmur of ordinary lives being lived in ordinary ways. A woman hurried past with a basket of laundry balanced on her hip, calling out a greeting to someone unseen. A cat slunk along a wall, intent on business of its own. Somewhere nearby, a piano was being played with more enthusiasm than skill, the notes drifting through an open window like musical ghosts. Martin Jenkins, they discovered, resided in a boarding house on Gower Street, one of those tall, narrow buildings that seemed to have been constructed with the specific intention of housing as many people in as little space as possible, while maintaining the absolute minimum standards of respectability. The front door was answered by a landlady who might have been 40 or 60. The kind of woman for whom age was less a number than a state of perpetual suspicion regarding the motives of anyone who came calling after dark. "Mr. Jenkins?" she repeated, eyeing the three men on her doorstep with the wariness of someone who had seen too many unpaid rents and midnight departures. "He's in, I suppose. Top floor, room 7. Mind you don't track mud on my carpets, and if you're here about debts, I'll have you know he's current on his rent and always has been." "We're not here about debts," Watson assured her with his most professional demeanour, the one that suggested trustworthiness and medical authority in equal measure. "It's a government matter." The words government matter worked their particular magic, as they usually did. The landlady's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching respect, tinged with curiosity. "Well then," she said, stepping aside. "Up you go. The stairs are steep, mind, and the light on the second landing wants replacing, but I haven't had the time, what with everything else." They climbed, leaving her standing in the doorway watching them ascend into the gloom. The stairs were indeed steep, and they creaked with every step, announcing their progress to anyone who cared to listen. The walls were papered in a pattern that might once have been cheerful, but had faded to a kind of melancholy beige, and the air smelled of boiled cabbage, coal smoke, and the particular mustiness that accumulates in places where too many people breathe the same air for too long. By the time they reached the top floor, Watson's leg, the old wound from Afghanistan that never quite let him forget it, was aching with the dull persistence that always accompanied damp weather and excessive stairs. He paused on the landing to catch his breath, noting that even Mycroft was breathing more heavily than usual, while Sherlock appeared entirely unaffected, his energy seeming to increase rather than diminish as they drew closer to their quarry. Room 7 was at the end of a narrow corridor, its door distinguishable from its neighbours only by the tarnished brass number tacked to its centre. Sherlock knocked, not loudly, but with the kind of firm authority that suggested he expected an answer and would not be leaving without one. For a long moment there was no response. Then came the sound of movement from within, hesitant, uncertain movement, followed by footsteps that approached the door and then stopped, as though whoever was inside was debating whether to open it at all. "Mr. Jenkins?" Sherlock called through the door, his voice carrying the perfect balance of authority and reasonableness. "We need to speak with you about an incident at the Diogenes Club this afternoon. I'm Sherlock Holmes, here with my brother Mycroft and Dr. Watson. This is not a police matter yet, but it is rather urgent." The pause that followed stretched long enough that Watson found himself wondering if they would need to fetch the landlady and her key. Then came the sound of a bolt being drawn back, and the door opened to reveal a young man whose face told a story of fear, exhaustion, and something very close to relief. Martin Jenkins was perhaps 28, with the kind of neat, forgettable features that would serve a government courier well. A man who could move through crowds without being noticed, deliver messages without being remembered. His brown hair was slightly dishevelled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and his shirt was open at the collar, the tie discarded. His eyes darted from one visitor to the next with the hunted look of an animal that knows it's been cornered, but hasn't quite decided whether to fight or flee. "Mr. Holmes?" he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the name. "Mr. Mycroft Holmes, I've been expecting someone to come. I knew it wouldn't take long. I knew you'd work it out." He stepped back from the door, a gesture that was half invitation, half resignation. "You'd better come in." The room was small, but tidy, the kind of space that a young man with limited means but unlimited ambition might maintain. A narrow bed occupied one wall, its coverlet pulled tight with military precision. A desk stood beneath the single window, papers neatly stacked, an inkwell capped, a pen laid precisely parallel to the edge. A bookshelf held a modest collection of volumes, mostly government manuals and reference works, Watson noted, but also a few novels, a volume of Tennyson's poetry, and what looked like a well-thumbed copy of Bradshaw's Railway Guide. A single chair, a small wardrobe, and a washstand completed the furnishings. On the mantelpiece, a photograph showed a woman and two small children, their faces solemn in the way of people who had never quite grown accustomed to being photographed. Jenkins closed the door behind them and leaned against it, not blocking their exit, but rather as though he needed the support to remain standing. "I didn't have a choice," he said. the words tumbling out before anyone had spoken. "You have to understand that. I didn't want to do it. I would never have done it if there had been any other way." Sherlock held up a hand. "Mr. Jenkins, perhaps you should start from the beginning. And please, do sit down before you collapse. You look as though you haven't slept in days." Jenkins moved to the chair, the only chair, but didn't sit, instead gripping its back with white-knuckled hands. "I haven't slept properly in weeks, not since they approached me." "They?" Mycroft's voice was quiet, but Watson could hear the tension beneath it, the controlled urgency of a man who was beginning to understand the shape of something much larger than a missing hat. "I don't know their names. I don't know who they really work for. But they knew things about me, Mr. Holmes. Things I'd kept private. Things that could destroy me, destroy my career, hurt my family." He gestured toward the photograph on the mantelpiece. "My sister and her children. Her husband died last year. Typhoid. She depends on me now, on what I send her each month, without my salary." He trailed off, the rest implied rather than stated. Watson found himself feeling that familiar mixture of sympathy and frustration that came with these cases. The world was full of men like Jenkins, decent men caught in impossible situations, forced to choose between honor and survival, principles and the people they loved. The Victorian era prided itself on its rigid morality, its clear distinctions between right and wrong. But reality was always so much more complicated than the moralists liked to admit. "What did they want from you?" Sherlock asked, moving to the window and looking out at the street below, where the mist had thickened into something approaching fog, turning the world soft and indistinct. "Information, at first," Jenkins said. "Nothing that seemed too important. Which ministers were meeting with which foreign ambassadors, the times of certain deliveries, the routes I took through Whitehall. I told myself it was harmless, that I wasn't really betraying anything significant. But then—" He swallowed hard. "Then they wanted me to make deliveries of my own, not official ones, private messages tucked into the packets I was already carrying. I never read them. I didn't want to know what they said." "And today," Mycroft prompted, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge now, the edge of a man whose patience, while considerable, was not infinite. Jenkins finally sat, collapsing into the chair as though his legs would no longer support him. "Today they wanted me to switch a hat, Mr. Mycroft Holmes's hat specifically. They gave me one that looked almost identical, told me to go to the Diogenes Club, create a distraction, and make the switch while the cloakroom was unattended. They said it was crucial, that it had to be done today, at that specific time. They said—" He looked up, his eyes pleading for understanding. "They said if I didn't do it, they would send letters to the Foreign Office, to my sister, to everyone. Letters detailing everything I'd done for them, with evidence I couldn't dispute. My career would be over. I'd go to prison. My sister would be left with nothing." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a small clock on the mantelpiece, and the distant sounds of the city outside. Watson watched Jenkins, and saw not a villain, but a victim, though he supposed the two were not always mutually exclusive. The young man had made choices, certainly, bad choices that had led him deeper and deeper into a web not of his own making, but that he had none the less helped to spin. "Where is the hat now?" Sherlock asked, turning from the window. "I don't have it," Jenkins said quickly. That was part of the arrangement. I was to take it from the club, walk 3 blocks north, and pass it to a man waiting by the pillar box on the corner of Waterloo Place and Pall Mall, which I did, exactly as instructed. He took the hat, gave me an envelope, and walked away. I never saw his face clearly. He wore a scarf pulled up high, and the rain was heavy enough to obscure details. The entire exchange took perhaps 10 seconds. "And the envelope?" Mycroft asked. Jenkins rose and went to the desk, opening a drawer and withdrawing a plain manila envelope, which he handed to Mycroft with the expression of someone relinquishing a live grenade. I haven't opened it. I was afraid to. I thought it might be money, or instructions, or... I don't know. I've been sitting here for hours, trying to decide what to do, whether to run or go to the authorities, or... He laughed, a bitter sound without humour. Or wait for someone like you to come knocking. Mycroft opened the envelope carefully, tilting it so that its contents, a small sheaf of papers, slid out into his hand. He examined them in silence for a long moment, his face betraying nothing, though Watson saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Finally, he looked up. "Letters," he said quietly. "The letters they threatened you with, I presume. Every compromising communication you've carried, every suspicious meeting you've facilitated, all carefully documented and ready to be deployed. This is your insurance, Mr. Jenkins. They've given you the evidence against yourself." "But why?" Watson asked, confused. "If they have this evidence, why give it to him?" "To ensure his continued silence," Sherlock said, moving away from the window to examine the papers over his brother's shoulder. "As long as he knows this evidence exists, he won't dare go to the authorities. But by giving it to him, they also ensure he has something to lose if they decide to betray him. It's leverage in both directions. Quite elegant, really, in a thoroughly despicable way." Jenkins had buried his face in his hands. "I'm ruined," he said, his voice muffled. "Even if you don't arrest me now, I'm ruined. They'll never stop. There will always be one more task, one more delivery, one more impossible thing they need me to do." Watson found himself stepping forward, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Perhaps not," he said gently. "You've told us the truth. That counts for something." "Does it?" Jenkins looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I've committed treason, Dr. Watson. I've betrayed my oath, my country, my position of trust. What truth can balance that?" It was Mycroft who answered, and his voice carried a weight of authority that filled the small room like a physical presence. "The truth that you were coerced, Mr. Jenkins. The truth that you came forward, albeit after being discovered, with information that may yet allow us to trace this network and dismantle it. The truth that you kept your sister and her children fed and housed in circumstances that would have broken lesser men." He paused, then added more quietly, "And the truth that the world is not, perhaps, as black and white as the Foreign Office manuals would have us believe." Sherlock had moved to the desk and was examining the papers scattered across its surface with the intense focus that Watson recognized as his hunting mode. "These delivery logs," he said, pointing to a stack of documents. "May I?" Jenkins nodded, too defeated to object. For several minutes, Sherlock studied the logs in silence, occasionally making a soft sound of interest or surprise. Finally, he straightened. "These deliveries you made, the unofficial ones, do you remember any specific details about them? Where they went? Who received them?" "Some," Jenkins said hesitantly. There was one to an address in Cheapside, to a man who claimed to be an import-export merchant, but whose office looked like it hadn't seen a legitimate shipment in years. Another to a boarding house in Limehouse, delivered to a woman who spoke with a Russian accent. And several to a tobacconist's shop in Covent Garden, always collected by the same man, always at the same time, 6 o'clock on Fridays. The tobacconist, Sherlock said, exchanging a glance with Mycroft. That's promising. A regular pattern suggests it's a fixed point in their network, not a temporary accommodation. Mycroft, we need to... Already noted, Mycroft interrupted. I'll have people watch in the shop by morning, discreetly. But the hat, Watson interjected, trying to bring them back to the immediate question. We still don't know why they wanted it specifically. What was so important about Mycroft's hat? Jenkins looked up, confusion evident on his face. There was something in it, he said, as though this should be obvious. They told me there was a message hidden in the lining, something Mr. Holmes had been carrying without knowing it. My job was to get the hat to them so they could retrieve the message before he discovered it. The room fell silent as this revelation settled over them. Watson looked at Mycroft, whose face had gone very still in that way that meant he was rapidly reassessing everything he thought he knew about the situation. But there was no message, Mycroft said slowly. I would have known. I examine my belongings regularly for exactly this sort of thing. There was nothing in my hat. Then perhaps, Sherlock said, his voice carrying a note of excited realization, the message wasn't for them to retrieve. Perhaps it was for them to place there, and by taking your hat, they prevented you from unwittingly delivering it to someone else. The implications hung in the air like smoke, curling and expanding to fill the space. If Sherlock was right, and Watson had learned long ago that Sherlock was usually right, then this was not a simple theft at all. It was an interception, a disruption of a communication network that Mycroft had been part of without knowing it. Someone had been using the elder Holmes as an unwitting courier, and someone else had discovered it and acted to prevent whatever message was supposed to be passed. We need that hat back, Mycroft said flatly. Immediately. We need to trace it, Sherlock corrected, which means following the chain from Jenkins's contact to whoever ultimately has it now. Mr. Jenkins, this man you gave the hat to, if you saw him again, would you recognize him? Perhaps, Jenkins said doubtfully. As I said, his face was obscured, but there was something about the way he moved, the way he stood. I might know him if I saw him again. Then we may have use for you yet, Sherlock said. Mycroft, he'll need protection. If they discover he's talked to us... Already considered, Mycroft said. Mr. Jenkins, you will come with us. I have a safe location where you can stay while we resolve this situation. You'll be guarded, fed, and kept well away from anyone who might wish you harm, or silence. Jenkins looked between them, hope and fear warring on his face. And after? Assuming we survive this, what happens to me? That, Mycroft said with brutal honesty, will depend largely on how useful you prove to be in unravelling this network. But I suspect that a young man who made mistakes under duress and then cooperated fully with the authorities might find his career survives, albeit with considerably more supervision in future. It was the best offer Jenkins was likely to get, and he knew it. He nodded slowly, then rose to gather a few belongings, a change of clothes, the photograph from the mantelpiece, the volume of Tennyson. Simple things, but Watson noticed that his hands had stopped shaking. Having made his confession, having surrendered to the inevitable, the young man seemed steadier, as though the weight he'd been carrying had been at least partially lifted. As they prepared to leave, Watson found himself looking around the small room one last time. Tomorrow it would be empty, or perhaps already let to another hopeful young clerk with dreams of advancement. The city was full of rooms like this, full of men like Jenkins, balanced on the knife edge between success and failure, honor and disgrace. Most would never face the choices Jenkins had faced, but some would, and Watson wondered how many would make different choices, or if anyone could truly know until the moment arrived. They descended the stairs in silence, Jenkins clutching his small bag, Mycroft and Sherlock flanking him like guards, or perhaps like brothers bearing up a wounded comrade. The landlady watched them go with narrowed eyes, but said nothing, though Watson suspected she would have many questions once they were gone. Outside, the fog had thickened considerably, turning London into a ghost city, where buildings loomed suddenly out of whiteness, and then disappeared again just as quickly. The gas lamps were barely visible, their light diffused into soft glowing spheres that seemed to float disconnected from their posts. It was the kind of fog that made the city feel both larger and smaller simultaneously. Larger because distances became impossible to judge, smaller because the visible world contracted to just a few feet in any direction. A cab materialized from the murk, and they climbed in. Jenkins sandwiched between Mycroft and Watson, while Sherlock took the forward-facing seat. As they pulled away from Gower Street, Watson looked back and thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway of the boarding house, watching them depart. But it might have been a trick of the fog, a shadow given substance by his imagination. "Where to?" the cabby called down. Mycroft gave an address that Watson didn't recognize, somewhere in South Kensington. A safe house, he presumed, one of the many unofficial resources that a man in Mycroft's position could access without troubling the official channels. As the cab rattled through the fog-bound streets, Watson found himself thinking about hats. Such a simple thing, really. A covering for the head, a badge of respectability, a shield against weather. And yet around this one hat had formed a web of intrigue involving coercion, espionage, interception, and secrets within secrets. The hat was gone, passed from Jenkins to an unknown contact, and from there to where? Who had it now? What were they doing with it? And what message had they prevented, or perhaps enabled? The mystery had deepened considerably since that afternoon when Mycroft had burst into 221B Baker Street in such unprecedented agitation. What had seemed like a simple theft now revealed itself as one thread in a much larger tapestry, and Watson suspected they had only just begun to understand its pattern. Beside him, Jenkins sat with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep, as though he were trying to memorize the sensation of being able to breathe freely, knowing it might not last. And Watson, feeling the ache in his leg and the weight of the evening's revelations, found himself hoping that when this was all over, the young man would indeed get his second chance. London rolled past in the fog, infinite and mysterious, keeping its secrets as it always had, as it always would. The safe house in South Kensington proved to be a modest but well-appointed flat above a respectable chemist's shop, the kind of establishment that catered to the neighbourhood's comfortable middle classes and asked no questions about the comings and goings in the rooms above, Mycroft saw Jenkins settled there with two silent, efficient men who had the look of retired military about them, the sort who would be perfectly pleasant company until the moment they needed to be something else entirely. Then, with Jenkins secure and the night deepening around them, the three made their way back to Baker Street, through fog that had become so thick it seemed almost solid, as though London itself were dissolving into some primordial state of uncertainty. By the time they reached 221B, it was past 10 o'clock, and the city had settled into that particular quality of late evening quiet, where the sounds of the day had faded, but the deep silence of true night had not yet arrived. Somewhere a dog barked. A late cab rattled past on an adjacent street, its wheels muffled by the fog. A church bell tolled the hour with patient regularity, each chime seeming to hang in the damp air before finally dissipating into the darkness. Mrs. Hudson had left the lamps burning low and a cold supper laid out under cloths, beef sandwiches, cheese, pickles, and a pot of tea kept warm under a cosy. Bless the woman, Watson thought as he removed his damp coat and hung it to dry by the fire, which had been banked but not extinguished, the coals glowing with that deep red warmth that spoke of careful tending. She had a gift for anticipating their needs, for knowing when they would return hungry and exhausted from some adventure, for maintaining the rhythms of domesticity, even when the household's occupants seemed determined to disrupt them. Sherlock went immediately to the fire and stirred it back to life, adding coal with the precise movements of someone performing a familiar ritual. The flames responded, licking upward with renewed vigour, casting dancing shadows across the walls and filling the room with that particular scent of burning coal that was as much a part of London's character as the fog itself. Watson poured tea for all three of them, strong, dark, sweetened with just the amount of sugar each preferred, which after so many years together he knew without thinking. Mycroft had settled into what Watson thought of as the client's chair, though tonight he was something more than a client, something closer to a co-conspirator, or perhaps a fellow victim. He held his teacup cradled in both hands as though drawing warmth from it, his usual imperturbable expression showing cracks of concern around the edges. The substitute hat, the one left in place of his own, sat on the table between them like an accusation, or perhaps a puzzle box waiting to be opened. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They simply sat in the restored warmth of the sitting room, drinking their tea, letting the comfort of familiar surroundings settle around them like a blanket. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, turning the world beyond into abstraction. Inside, the fire crackled and the clock ticked, and Mrs. Hudson's tea worked its restorative magic, as tea always did for Englishmen facing uncertainty. Finally, Sherlock set down his cup and reached for the hat. "Now then," he said, his voice carrying that particular note of focused interest that meant he was fully engaged with a problem. "Let us see what secrets you contain, my anonymous friend." He held the hat up to the firelight, turning it slowly, examining every inch of its surface with eyes that missed nothing. The grey felt was of good quality, but not exceptional, the kind worn by thousands of clerks and minor officials throughout London. The Petersham band was slightly worn, as Mycroft had noted, showing the pattern of regular handling. The inner lining was intact, showing no signs of having been tampered with, no hidden pockets or suspicious bulges. "Manufactured by Locke & Co.," Sherlock murmured, reading the faint maker's mark inside the crown. "But not sold through their usual channels. The serial number has been deliberately obscured. See here, Watson, how it's been scratched away. Someone didn't want this hat traced back to its point of purchase. Why go to that trouble for an ordinary hat, unless it was intended for use in something clandestine?" Watson leaned in to examine the indicated area. Perhaps it was stolen itself, or purchased second-hand specifically to avoid creating a record. Precisely. This hat was chosen with care, selected to be as close to Mycroft's as possible while remaining anonymous, untraceable, which suggests planning, forethought, and access to detailed information about Mycroft's habits and possessions. Sherlock set the hat aside and turned his attention to Mycroft himself. "Tell me about your hat, brother. Not the one that was stolen, but your relationship to it. When did you acquire it? Where do you keep it when you're not wearing it? Who might have had opportunity to examine it closely enough to commission a near-identical replacement?" Mycroft's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. "I purchased it 18 months ago from Locke & Co., my usual haberdashers. It's been with me nearly every day since, to the office, to the club, occasionally to official functions. When I'm home, it hangs on the stand in my hall. When I'm at the Diogenes, it's in the cloakroom. At the office—" He paused, consideration dawning on his face. "At the office, it hangs on a rack outside my private rooms, visible to anyone walking past, accessible to anyone with business in the building. Which is to say, potentially dozens of people," Sherlock said with satisfaction. "Government buildings are wonderfully porous places, aren't they? All those couriers and clerks and minor officials flowing through, most of them barely noticed, all of them with eyes and hands and the opportunity to observe, to note, to report. Someone needed to know enough about your hat to commission this replacement. Someone had to study it, measure it, note its particular characteristics. That takes time and access." "You think the plot originates from within Whitehall?" Watson asked, troubled by the implications. "I think the plot includes people within Whitehall," Sherlock corrected. "Whether it originates there or merely makes use of resources there remains to be determined. But Jenkins's story suggests a network, and networks require infrastructure, communication, coordination. This wasn't the work of a single disgruntled employee or a foreign agent working alone. This was organized." The fire popped and settled. Mycroft had gone very still, his teacup forgotten in his hands, his gaze distant in that way that meant he was accessing the vast filing system of his mind, cross-referencing information, looking for patterns. Watson had seen Sherlock do the same thing countless times, that moment of withdrawal into pure thought, the body present, but the mind elsewhere, walking through corridors of memory and deduction. "The cipher," Mycroft said suddenly. "Jenkins said they told him there was a message in my hat, hidden in the lining. But there was no message, I'm certain of it. Which means either they were mistaken, or the message was meant to be placed there, not retrieved from there," Sherlock finished. "Yes, I've been thinking about that. Suppose your hat was being used as a dead drop, Mycroft. Someone with access to your routine could place a message in your hat, knowing you would wear it to the Diogenes Club at a specific time on a specific day. And someone else, also with knowledge of your routine, could arrange to be at the club at the right moment to retrieve it. You would be entirely innocent, an unwitting courier carrying secrets while believing yourself to be simply going about your day. Watson felt a chill despite the fire's warmth. But that means Mycroft has been compromised, Sherlock said flatly. Not through any action of his own, but simply by being predictable. His routines are known, his habits are established, and someone has been exploiting them to move information right under his nose, and under the noses of everyone who might be watching him. Mycroft set down his teacup with a sharp click. "I am not predictable," he said, and there was an edge to his voice now, not quite anger, but something close. "I vary my routines. I take precautions. I am not some amateur to be used by—" "Brother," Sherlock interrupted gently, "you go to the Diogenes Club every Thursday at precisely 10 o'clock. You have done so for the better part of a decade. You sit in the same reading room, in the same chair, for almost exactly 3 hours. You leave your hat in the same cubby. You are, in matters of personal habit, as regular as clockwork, which is not a criticism. Most of us are. But it is a vulnerability." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Watson watched Mycroft process this, watched him adjust his understanding of himself and his world, watched the man who prided himself on being unpredictable and unknowable confront the reality that he was neither. It was a humbling moment, and Watson found himself looking away, granting Mycroft what privacy he could in the shared space. "So, what was the message?" Watson asked, trying to move them forward. "If it was supposed to be placed in the hat today but wasn't, what information was meant to be passed?" "That," Sherlock said, rising, and beginning to pace in that restless way that meant his mind was working faster than his body could comfortably contain, "is the crucial question. Whatever it was important enough that when the passing failed, when the hat was switched before the message could be placed, someone panicked enough to risk Jenkins's exposure by demanding the switch immediately rather than waiting for a better opportunity. Or they didn't know the switch had already occurred," Mycroft suggested. "Perhaps the person meant to place the message in my hat doesn't know that the network has been disrupted. Perhaps they're still planning to make their delivery, unaware that they'll be placing their secrets in the wrong hat." Sherlock stopped pacing and turned to face his brother, and Watson saw a slow smile spread across his face, the smile of a hunter who had just spotted his prey. "Mycroft, you're brilliant. If we assume that the network has been disrupted without the sender knowing it, then somewhere in London tonight, someone is carrying a message they believe will be passed tomorrow at the Diogenes Club. And if we can intercept that person, or better yet, allow them to make their delivery and see who retrieves it, we could potentially identify both ends of the communication chain," Mycroft finished. "But it requires that I return to the club tomorrow, wearing this substitute hat as though nothing had happened, as though I hadn't noticed the switch at all." "Can you do that?" Watson asked. "Won't people have noticed your distress today? Won't questions have been asked?" "Questions were asked," Mycroft admitted, "but the official story is that I was feeling unwell, a stomach complaint, nothing serious. Stamford will have spread that version among the staff and such members as inquired. If I return tomorrow, appearing perfectly fine, wearing what appears to be my usual hat, the fiction will hold." Sherlock resumed his pacing, his long fingers tapping against his lips in thought. The timing is crucial. If the message is meant to be placed before you arrive at the club, then we need to monitor your hat from the moment you leave your residence. If it's meant to be placed while you're there, we need someone watching the cloakroom continuously, and if it's meant to be retrieved after you leave, we need to track the hat's movements after you've departed. All of which requires more than just the three of us, Watson pointed out. We'll need help. Watchers, followers, people who can maintain surveillance without being noticed. I can arrange for people, Mycroft said. Discreet people, people who understand the stakes. But Sherlock, we need to consider another possibility. What if they know we've discovered the network? What if this is all a distraction, a way to occupy our attention while something else happens elsewhere? It was a sobering thought. Watson found himself looking around the familiar sitting room, as though seeing it differently, as though the walls themselves might be compromised, as though every shadow might hide a watcher. The world had suddenly become more complicated, more uncertain. What had begun as a missing hat now sprawled into questions of espionage, of networks within networks, of messages hidden and messages intercepted, of routines exploited and trust betrayed. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11, each chime clear and distinct in the quiet room. Outside, the fog had somehow grown thicker still, pressing against the windows like something alive, something that wanted in. Watson thought about Jenkins sitting in his safe house in South Kensington, about the unknown person who even now might be preparing to place a message in a hat they thought was Mycroft's but wasn't, about the intricate web of deception and counter-deception they were all now caught in. "We're missing something," Sherlock said suddenly, stopping his pacing to stare into the fire. "Something obvious. Something we should have seen immediately. The question isn't just who wanted the hat or what message was meant to be passed. The question is, why now? Why today? What was so time-sensitive that it required immediate action, that made them risk exposing Jenkins, that made them deviate from what must have been a carefully established routine?" Mycroft leaned forward. "You think there's a deadline?" "I think there's a catalyst. Something happened, or is about to happen, that made this particular communication crucial. Jenkins said they'd been having him make deliveries for weeks, that the network had been operating for some time. So why the sudden urgency? Why the switch today specifically?" Watson tried to think like Sherlock, tried to see the pattern beneath the pattern. Could it be related to something in the news? Some political development? Or the Admiralty report? Mycroft said quietly. "Oh, Lord, the Admiralty report." Both Sherlock and Watson turned to look at him. Mycroft had gone pale, his usual composed expression replaced by something that looked very much like fear. "What Admiralty report?" Sherlock demanded. "It's being finalized this week," Mycroft said, speaking quickly. Now, the words tumbling out. "A comprehensive assessment of British naval readiness in the event of European conflict. Fleet positions, ammunition stores, strategic weaknesses, everything. It's been in preparation for months, the most sensitive document the Admiralty has produced in a decade. The final version goes to the Cabinet on Monday morning for review before being presented to the Queen next week." "And you have access to it," Sherlock said, understanding dawning. "I helped write portions of it. I've seen the complete draft. I know what it contains, what it reveals about our vulnerabilities. And if someone wanted to pass that information to a foreign power—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear enough. Watson felt his mouth go dry. This was no longer about a missing hat, or even about catching spies. This was about the security of the Empire itself, about information that could shift the balance of power in Europe, about secrets that men would kill to protect or to obtain. Then we know what the message would have contained, Sherlock said, and his voice had gone hard, cold, the voice he used when the game had become deadly serious. Details from the Admiralty report passed to someone who would pay handsomely for them. And if the network has been disrupted, if the usual communication channel has been blocked, they'll be looking for alternative methods to pass the information. They'll be desperate, which makes them dangerous. I need to get word to the Admiralty, Mycroft said, rising from his chair. They need to know the report may be compromised, that they need to increase security, change distribution plans, perhaps even alter the content if possible. No, Sherlock said sharply. Not yet. If you sound the alarm, everyone involved will scatter. We'll lose our chance to identify them, to roll up the entire network. We need to maintain the fiction that nothing has been discovered, that the routine continues as normal, which means you go to the Diogenes Club tomorrow precisely as planned, wearing the substitute hat, and we watch to see who makes contact and how. But the risk, Mycroft began, is manageable if we're careful, Sherlock interrupted. Brother, you know I'm right. This is our best chance to not only protect the report, but to identify everyone involved in trying to steal it. We can't waste that opportunity on premature panic. Watson watched the two brothers lock eyes, watched them communicate in that way they had, that transcended words, watched Mycroft finally nod slowly, reluctantly, accepting the logic even as everything in him wanted to raise the alarm. Very well, Mycroft said. But we do this my way, with my people, and with protocols in place to abort the moment it appears to be going wrong. Agreed. Agreed, Sherlock said. They spent the next hour planning, laying out contingencies, identifying resources, mapping the movements and timing of what would essentially be a carefully choreographed performance with Mycroft as the unwitting actor and the substitute hat as the prop around which everything revolved. Watson took notes, asking questions, trying to identify potential weaknesses in their plan. The tea grew cold and was replaced with something stronger, brandy that Sherlock poured with a generous hand, the amber liquid catching the firelight as it filled their glasses. By midnight, they had a plan. It wasn't perfect, no plan ever was, but it was workable, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, comprehensive enough to cover most contingencies. Mycroft would go home, would spend tomorrow morning at his office as normal, would proceed to the Diogenes Club at his usual time wearing the substitute hat. Meanwhile, watchers would monitor his residence, his route, the club itself, looking for any approach, any attempt to place or retrieve a message. And Sherlock and Watson would be at the heart of it all, the spider at the center of the web, ready to move when the moment came. Mycroft left just after midnight, slipping out into the fog with his borrowed hat pulled low and two of his people flanking him at a discreet distance. Watson watched from the window until they disappeared into the murk, then turned back to find Sherlock standing by the fire, holding the substitute hat once more, turning it slowly in his hands. "Do you think we'll catch them?" Watson asked. "I think," Sherlock said slowly, "that tomorrow will be very interesting indeed. And Watson, make sure your revolver is loaded. I suspect we may need it." The fire burned low, the fog pressed close, and somewhere in London's vast sprawl, secrets waited to be passed, stolen, protected, or betrayed. The game, as Sherlock liked to say, was afoot. Friday morning arrived with the fog still clinging to London like a stubborn memory, though the rain had finally ceased its patient drumming against the city's stones and tiles. The Thames, that great artery through the heart of the metropolis, moved with its usual murky determination, carrying the tide inland from the sea and bringing with it the smells of salt and mud, of commerce and industry, of all the invisible connections that bound Britain to the wider world beyond its shores. Watson had slept poorly, his dreams full of hats and shadows, of messages passed in silence and networks that sprawled like spiderwebs across a city that suddenly seemed less familiar than threatening. He woke to find Sherlock already dressed and standing at the window, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, his sharp profile outlined against the grey morning light that filtered through the thinning fog. "Good, you're awake," Sherlock said without turning. "Mycroft sent word an hour ago. Everything is proceeding as planned. He's currently at his office, being conspicuously normal. His people are in position around the building. No approaches yet. No suspicious activity. The hat sits on its rack outside his office, visible to anyone passing by, and according to the watcher stationed nearby, at least 7 people have walked past it this morning without showing any unusual interest." Watson rose and moved to join him at the window, accepting the coffee that Sherlock handed him, strong, black, exactly as he liked it, in the morning when his mind needed sharpening. Below, Baker Street was coming to life with the day's business. A milk cart rattled past, its driver calling out greetings to the shopkeepers beginning to open their establishments. A crossing sweeper worked at clearing the muck from the intersection, his broom moving with the practiced rhythm of long habit. 2 women in respectable but not fashionable dress hurried past, their heads bent together in conversation, their shopping baskets swinging from their arms. Ordinary London, carrying on its ordinary business, while beneath the surface secrets moved and schemes unfolded. "What time does Mycroft leave for the club?" Watson asked. "9:30, as always. He'll walk. He claims it's for his health, though I suspect it's more about maintaining routine and ensuring he arrives precisely at 10 o'clock. The route takes him through St. James's Park, along Birdcage Walk, and then up onto Pall Mall. Approximately 23 minutes at his usual pace, accounting for his tendency to pause near the lake to observe the waterfowl." Watson smiled despite the tension. "You've timed your brother's walk to the club?" "Of course. One must know these things. The route offers multiple opportunities for someone to approach him, to brush against him, to make contact in a way that might appear accidental, but would allow for the placement of a message in his hat. The park is particularly vulnerable. Paths that cross, benches where one might sit beside a stranger, vendors where one might pause to make a purchase. If I were planning to make contact, I'd choose the park." "Then that's where we'll be," Watson said, finishing his coffee and moving to dress properly for what promised to be a long day of watching and waiting. By 9 o'clock, they were positioned in St. James's Park, that green refuge in the heart of political London, where members of Parliament and clerks alike came to walk and think and briefly escape the weight of governance. The park had a particular character in the morning, quieter than at midday, populated by those who worked nearby and took their constitutional before beginning the day's business. Nursemaids pushed prams along the paths, elderly gentlemen fed the ducks at the lake's edge, and the occasional young couple walked arm in arm, stealing moments of privacy in the public space. Sherlock had chosen their position with care, a bench near one of the main paths that Mycroft would take, but angled so they could observe without being obviously observant. Watson had brought the morning newspaper, which he held open as though reading, while Sherlock appeared to be sketching, his pencil moving, across a small pad in what might look like artistic endeavour, but was actually a method of recording everyone who passed, noting their appearance, their behaviour, their potential significance. The air smelled of damp grass and earth, of the lake's muddy shore, of the flowering shrubs that the park keepers maintained with such devotion. Ducks paddled across the water's surface, leaving V-shaped wakes behind them, occasionally upending themselves to search the bottom for whatever sustenance ducks found there. A swan drifted past with imperious grace, its neck curved in that perfect S that artists had been trying to capture for centuries. "There," Sherlock murmured, not looking up from his sketch-pad. "The man in the brown coat, approaching from the north. He's been circling the park for the past 10 minutes, never settling, always moving. Watch how he checks his pocket watch every few minutes. He's waiting for something. Or someone." Watson shifted his newspaper slightly, creating an opening through which he could observe the indicated figure without being obvious about it. The man was perhaps 40, solidly built, with the kind of unremarkable features that would make him difficult to describe later. His brown coat was of good quality, but not new. His hat was pulled low against the lingering damp, and yes, he did keep consulting his watch with the frequency of someone anxious about time. "Could be anyone," Watson said quietly. "Someone late for an appointment, someone meeting a friend who hasn't arrived." "Could be," Sherlock agreed. "But notice how he positions himself. Every time he pauses, it's at a point where he can see multiple paths, multiple approaches. He's not waiting for someone he knows, or he'd stay in one place. He's watching for someone, ready to move when they appear." They watched as the man made another circuit, his path taking him past their bench without a glance in their direction. Watson felt the familiar tension that came with surveillance work, the need to remain alert while appearing relaxed, the constant assessment of whether they'd been noticed, the readiness to move at a moment's notice while appearing to be doing nothing more urgent than enjoying a morning in the park. At 9:27, Mycroft appeared at the park's eastern entrance, moving with his characteristic measured pace, his borrowed hat sitting properly on his head, his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the path. He looked, Watson thought, exactly like a senior government official taking his daily constitutional, which was precisely what he was, except that today his routine had become a trap, and he was the bait. The man in the brown coat noticed Mycroft immediately. Watson saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his hand went to his watch again, but didn't actually check the time, the slight change in direction that would bring him across Mycroft's path in approximately 30 seconds. "Here we go," Sherlock breathed. But Mycroft wasn't alone. Watson spotted them now, the watchers that Mycroft had positioned. A woman feeding ducks who hadn't moved from her spot in 15 minutes. A gentleman reading near the lake who had turned his page exactly once in the same period. A park keeper working with studied slowness at trimming a hedge that looked already perfectly trimmed. They were good, subtle enough that Watson hadn't noticed them until he knew to look, positioned to cover multiple angles and respond quickly if needed. The man in brown approached Mycroft's path, timing his movement perfectly. In another few seconds, they would intersect. The man would brush past, or perhaps stop to ask the time. And in that moment of contact, whatever was going to happen would happen, except it didn't. At the last possible moment, a child, a boy of perhaps 8, broke away from his nursemaid and ran directly into the man's path, chasing after a ball that had rolled away from his game. The man stumbled, caught off balance, forced to stop abruptly to avoid trampling the child. The nursemaid hurried forward with apologies, gathering the boy, scolding him gently while casting apologetic glances at the man who waved her off with what appeared to be good humour. By the time the small drama had resolved itself, Mycroft had passed the intersection point and was continuing on his way, oblivious to the near contact. The man in brown stood watching him go, his posture suggesting frustration or perhaps disappointment, before he turned and walked away in the opposite direction, his pace increasing as though he'd suddenly remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere. "Natural interruption or staged?" Watson asked quietly. "I'm not sure," Sherlock admitted, which was unusual enough to be concerning. The child appeared genuine, but the timing was extraordinarily convenient. Either we just witnessed the network protecting itself by preventing a contact that might have been observed, or that was the clumsiest approach I've ever seen disrupted by sheer chance. They rose from their bench and followed Mycroft at a discreet distance, watching him make his way out of the park and onto Birdcage Walk, that broad street that ran along the park's southern edge, with Buckingham Palace visible in the distance. The morning traffic was increasing now, hansoms and private carriages, omnibuses carrying workers to their destinations, delivery carts making their rounds. The city was fully awake, the fog burning off to reveal a sky that promised, if not sunshine, at least the absence of rain. Mycroft maintained his steady pace, pausing once to observe a squad of guards marching past in their distinctive red coats, their boots striking the pavement in perfect unison. He nodded to an acquaintance passing in the opposite direction, some other government functionary whom Watson didn't recognize, but who clearly knew Mycroft well enough to tip his hat in greeting. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just another morning in the life of a senior civil servant. They followed him onto Pall Mall, that street of power and privilege, where the great clubs stood like monuments to masculine certainty and imperial confidence. Other gentlemen were making their way to their own clubs, creating a small tide of respectability flowing toward those various establishments. Watson noticed several people he recognized, a minor member of the royal family, a judge whose decisions were regularly reported in the Times, a celebrated author whose novels Watson had read with pleasure. Mycroft reached the Diogenes Club at precisely 10 o'clock, as he always did, as everyone would expect him to. He climbed the steps, the door opened for him, and he disappeared inside, swallowed by that temple of silence and solitude. "Now what?" Watson asked, looking around at the street, at the other clubs, at the passing traffic. "Do we wait here? Go inside?" "We can't go inside. We're not members, and the Diogenes doesn't welcome visitors. But Mycroft's people are positioned throughout the building. If anyone approaches the hat, we'll know." Sherlock pointed across the street. "There, that tobacconist's shop. It has a clear view of the Diogenes entrance, and I suspect the proprietor will be amenable to allowing us to occupy his window for a few hours, if we make it worth his while." The tobacconist proved indeed amenable, particularly after Sherlock made a generous purchase of cigars, and explained that they were conducting surveillance on behalf of Her Majesty's government, a description that was technically accurate, if somewhat misleading. The proprietor, a wizened man who claimed to have served in the Crimea and had the scars to prove it, showed them to a small room at the back of his shop that had windows overlooking the street, and provided chairs, tea, and a running commentary on everyone who passed that suggested he would have made an excellent detective himself in another life. "That one there," he said, pointing to a well-dressed gentleman entering the club next door to the Diogenes. "That's Lord Pemberton's youngest son. Gambles too much, drinks too much, and his father pays his debts too often. And that one," indicating a clerk hurrying past with a stack of papers, "works at the Foreign Office, but wants to be a poet, writes terrible verse, and inflicts it on anyone who'll listen." Watson found himself warming to the old man, enjoying his observations, even as he kept his own attention focused on the Diogenes entrance. The street scene was like a play being performed for their benefit, the constant flow of humanity, each person with their own story, their own purpose, their own secrets. How many of them, Watson wondered, were exactly who they appeared to be? How many were playing roles, maintaining fictions, hiding truths that would shock those who thought they knew them? An hour passed, then another. The morning stretched toward noon with that slow patience that surveillance, work demanded. Watson's leg began to ache from sitting still, and he rose periodically to stretch, to pace the small room, to keep his muscles from stiffening. Sherlock remained motionless, except for his eyes, which never stopped moving, cataloguing, assessing, watching. "Nothing," Sherlock said finally, frustration evident in his voice. "No approaches, no suspicious activity, nothing. Either they know we're watching, or the contact was supposed to happen before Mycroft arrived at the club, or we're watching the wrong place," Watson finished. "If the message was supposed to be placed in his hat at his office, or during his walk, and that opportunity was missed, perhaps they're not trying to make contact at all today. Perhaps they're waiting for another opportunity, another routine, another approach." Sherlock stood abruptly, moving to the window and staring down at the street below, as though he could compel something to happen through sheer force of will. "No," he said. "No, there's urgency here. Jenkins said they needed the hat immediately, that they couldn't wait. The Admiralty report goes to Cabinet on Monday, which means whatever information they want to pass needs to be passed soon, this weekend at the latest. They can't afford to wait for the next Thursday, the next routine cycle. They need to act now." "Then where?" Watson asked. "If not the park, if not the club, then where would they make contact?" The answer came not from Sherlock, but from below, where a messenger boy had just delivered a note to the tobacconist, who brought it up to them with the air of someone delivering important intelligence. Sherlock tore it open, read quickly, and his expression shifted from frustration to sharp interest. "Mycroft," he said. "He's leaving the club early. 20 minutes ago he received an urgent summons to the Foreign Office. A meeting that can't be postponed, a matter requiring his immediate attention. He's leaving now, taking a cab directly there rather than walking." "Is it genuine?" Watson asked, already moving toward the door. "I don't know, but it's certainly convenient. If someone wanted to force Mycroft into an unplanned movement, into a situation where his routine is disrupted and his usual precautions might be compromised. This would be an excellent method. Sherlock was already descending the stairs, Watson close behind him. "Come on. The Foreign Office is on Downing Street, just a few minutes' walk from here. If we hurry." They emerged onto Pall Mall just in time to see Mycroft descending the steps of the Diogenes Club, his hat firmly on his head, his expression suggesting annoyance at having his routine disrupted. A hansom cab waited at the curb, and Mycroft climbed in with the heavy movements of a man who found this all tremendously inconvenient. The cab pulled away, heading west toward Whitehall, and the government offices that clustered there like organs in the body of state. Sherlock hailed another cab with an imperious gesture, and they climbed in, Sherlock leaning forward to give the driver instructions and a promise of extra payment for speed. London flowed past the windows as they followed, the grand facades of Pall Mall giving way to the broader expanse of Trafalgar Square with its column and lions and pigeons, then down Whitehall with its impressive government buildings housing the machinery of empire. The street was busy with midday traffic, with civil servants hurrying to and from meetings, with tourists staring up at the architecture, with all the business of governance being conducted in those stone halls. Mycroft's cab turned onto Downing Street, that modest thoroughfare that housed some of the most important addresses in Britain, and pulled to a stop outside the Foreign Office. Mycroft descended, paid his driver, and entered the building through the main entrance, his borrowed hat still firmly in place. "There," Watson said, pointing. "That man near the corner. He's been watching the building." Sherlock followed his gaze and nodded slowly. "Yes, same brown coat as the man in the park, though I don't think it's the same individual. Similar build, similar bearing, but not identical. A colleague, perhaps. Another member of the network." They watched as the man consulted his watch, that same gesture they'd seen in the park, and then turned to walk away. Not hurrying, but not dawdling either. Just another anonymous figure in the crowd of anonymous figures that filled London's streets. "Follow him," Sherlock said to their driver. "Stay well back. Don't let him see us, but don't lose him either." "Right you are, sir," the driver said with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just been handed the most interesting fare of his day. They followed the man east, back toward the heart of the city, through streets that grew progressively busier and more commercial. Past the law courts and the banks, past the Royal Exchange with its classical portico, into the maze of lanes and alleys where London's commercial life pulsed and flowed like blood through veins. The man moved with confidence, clearly familiar with the route, turning corners without hesitation, crossing streets with the timing of someone who knew the traffic patterns. Finally, he entered a small cafe on a side street near the monument, one of those establishments that catered to clerks and merchants, serving simple food and strong tea to men who had neither time nor money for elaborate meals. Sherlock paid their driver, and they entered after him, finding seats at a corner table that offered a view of the entire room. The man had joined another figure at a table near the back, older, better dressed, with the look of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. They were speaking in low voices, their heads bent close together, and even from across the room Watson could see the tension in their postures, the urgency in their gestures. "Can you read lips?" Watson whispered. "Not reliably, and not from this angle. But look at the older man's hands. See how he keeps tapping the table, that repetitive gesture. He's agitated, possibly angry. Something hasn't gone according to plan. They watched for 10 minutes as the conversation continued. Finally, the older man reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, thick, cream-coloured, the kind used for official correspondence. He slid it across the table to the man in brown, who took it and tucked it into his own coat without examining its contents. Payment, Watson suggested, or instructions, or the information they were trying to pass through Mycroft, Sherlock said quietly. Perhaps when the original plan failed, they decided on a more direct approach. Whatever that envelope contains, it's important enough that they're meeting in daylight in a public place, which suggests either desperation or confidence that they're not being watched. The two men stood, shook hands briefly, and separated, the older man leaving through the front entrance, while the man in brown headed toward the back, presumably toward a rear exit. "You take the older one," Sherlock said quickly. "I'll follow Brown Coat. We meet back at Baker Street in 2 hours or sooner if either of us discovers something urgent. Be careful, Watson. These men may be more dangerous than they appear." Watson nodded and rose, keeping the older man in sight as he emerged onto the street and began walking north toward London Bridge. The game had changed. The pieces were moving in new patterns, and Watson felt that familiar combination of excitement and apprehension that came with following a suspect through London's crowded streets, knowing that at any moment the hunter could become the hunted, that one wrong step could alert their quarry and send them scattering like birds before a cat. The older man walked with the confidence of someone who believed himself unobserved, and Watson followed at a careful distance, just another anonymous figure in the eternal crowd that was London, watching and waiting to see where this path would lead. Behind him, the cafe door swung shut, and somewhere in the vast city, Mycroft Holmes sat in a meeting at the Foreign Office, his borrowed hat hanging on a rack, unaware that the secrets people had tried to steal from him were now moving through London streets in an envelope, carried by men who believed they'd succeeded despite all attempts to stop them. The afternoon sun broke through the lingering clouds, casting London in sudden, sharp relief, and Watson hurried on through streets that seemed suddenly less familiar, less safe, more full of shadows and secrets than he'd ever imagined possible. The older man led Watson on a meandering journey through the city's labyrinthine streets, past the Tower and along the Thames, where the river traffic moved with its usual chaotic purpose. Barges heavy with coal and grain, passenger steamers churning against the current, small boats darting between the larger vessels like minnows among whales. The smell of the river was strong here, that particular combination of salt and mud and industrial effluent that defined London's relationship with the water that had made it great. Watson kept his distance, grateful for the crowds that provided cover, grateful too for his years of experience following Sherlock on similar pursuits. The art of surveillance was not, as the uninitiated might think, about staying hidden. It was about staying unremarkable, about being one face among thousands, about moving with the rhythm of the crowd rather than against it. The older man never looked back, never showed any sign of suspecting he was followed, and Watson began to relax slightly, to settle into the rhythm of the pursuit. They crossed London Bridge, that great span connecting the city to Southwark, where the character of the streets changed immediately, rougher, poorer, more desperate. Here were the warehouses and factories, the shabby lodging houses and public houses that catered to dock workers and sailors, the pawnshops and cheap theatres. This was the London that tourists rarely saw, that respectable society pretended didn't exist, where life was harder and shorter and played out in streets that never quite lost the smell of the river's rot. The older man turned into a narrow lane between two warehouses, and Watson hesitated, knowing that to follow down such a confined space was to risk exposure. But to wait might mean losing his quarry entirely. He counted to 10, giving the man time to move deeper into the lane, then followed, his hand instinctively moving to his coat pocket, where his revolver rested with comforting weight. The lane was dim, even in the afternoon light, the buildings on either side rising tall enough to block the sun, their walls streaked with soot and damp. Water dripped from somewhere overhead with a steady, melancholy rhythm. A rat scuttled across the cobblestones, pausing to regard Watson with the calculating indifference of a creature that had long ago stopped fearing humans. At the lane's end, Watson emerged into a small courtyard, surrounded by buildings in various states of disrepair. The older man had disappeared, but there were 3 possible exits from the courtyard, 3 directions he might have taken. Watson cursed softly under his breath, moving to the centre of the space and trying to think like Sherlock. Which way would a man go if he were heading home, versus if he were making a delivery, versus if he'd spotted his tail and was attempting to lose it? "Dr. Watson, I presume?" The voice came from behind him, cultured, amused, and entirely too close. Watson spun to find the older man standing in a doorway he'd somehow missed, the cream-coloured envelope still visible in his hand, his expression one of mild curiosity, mixed with something that might have been respect. "You're quite good," the man continued, stepping fully into the courtyard. "Not as good as your friend Mr. Holmes, perhaps, but competent. You maintained proper distance, varied your pace, never looked directly at me. Unfortunately, you also have a distinctive gait. That slight favour of your right leg, a legacy of your time in Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken. Once I noticed it, you became rather easy to identify in the crowd." Watson's hand remained near his pocket, though he didn't draw his weapon. "Not yet. You knew you were being followed. From the moment I left the cafe, yes. Your Mr. Sherlock Holmes is not the only person in London who knows how to observe his surroundings, Doctor. Though I must admit, I'm impressed by how quickly you identified me. The meeting with Henderson was meant to appear entirely innocent." Henderson, the man in the brown coat. "One of several couriers in our employ. Not the brightest, I'm afraid, but reliable enough for simple tasks. Though it seems his attempt to make contact with Mr. Mycroft Holmes this morning was spectacularly unsuccessful." The man smiled, a thin expression without warmth. "The child in the park? You're doing, I assume? Or Mr. Mycroft Holmes's? Quite clever." Watson said nothing, his mind racing. The man was too calm, too composed. He'd led Watson here deliberately, which meant either he was extraordinarily confident, or this was a trap. Probably both. "I'm going to reach into my coat now," the man said, moving slowly and deliberately. "Not for a weapon, but to show you something. Please don't shoot me, Doctor. It would be most inconvenient for both of us." He withdrew the envelope and held it up so Watson could see it clearly. Then, with deliberate care, he broke the seal and removed the contents, several sheets of paper covered in what appeared to be official text. He glanced at them briefly, then handed them across to Watson. "Go ahead," he said. "Read them. I think you'll find them quite interesting." Watson took the papers with his left hand, keeping his right free. His eyes scanned the first page, and he felt his confusion deepen. It was a report on agricultural yields in Sussex, dry statistical data about wheat and barley production, utterly mundane and entirely useless to anyone interested in military secrets. "I don't understand," Watson said. "Don't you?" The man's smile widened slightly. "Doctor, did you really think we would be foolish enough to conduct actual espionage in such an obvious manner? Meeting in public cafes, passing documents in plain sight. This entire morning has been theatre, Doctor. A performance designed to draw out watchers like yourself, to identify who's paying attention to whom, to map the network of surveillance that Mr. Mycroft Holmes has no doubt deployed around himself." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp courtyard air. "You know about the hat." "Of course we know about the hat. We switched it, after all. But not for the reasons you think. Tell me, Doctor, has it occurred to you that perhaps the theft of Mr. Mycroft Holmes's hat was meant to be discovered? That perhaps we wanted him to know his routine had been compromised, to see how he would react, to force him and his brother to deploy resources in ways that would reveal the extent of their counterintelligence capabilities?" "That's absurd," Watson said, but even as he spoke, doubt crept in. Had they been manipulated from the beginning? Had the entire affair been designed to make them react, to expose their methods and resources? Is it? Consider. A theft from one of London's most exclusive clubs. Impossible to miss. Guaranteed to provoke a response. A courier who confesses almost immediately when confronted, providing just enough information to seem useful, while actually revealing nothing of value. A series of obvious surveillance opportunities that go nowhere. And now, the dramatic revelation that the documents being passed contain nothing but agricultural statistics. The man pocketed the papers again. "We've learned a great deal about your network this morning, Doctor. Who your watchers are, how they position themselves, how quickly you can mobilize resources. Very useful information indeed." Watson's hand had moved fully to his revolver now, though he hadn't drawn it. "And what makes you think I'll let you simply walk away with that information?" "Because, Doctor, you're not a murderer. You're a soldier, yes, and you've killed when necessary, but not in cold blood in a London courtyard. And because shooting me would gain you nothing, I've already passed along what I've learned to my associates. And because—" He paused, his expression shifting to something more serious. "Because this isn't actually about espionage at all. Not in the way you think. Then what is it about? It's about proving a point, about demonstrating to certain parties that their security is not as robust as they believe, that their systems can be penetrated, their routines exploited. The Admiralty report that Mr. Mycroft Holmes is so concerned about. We have no interest in it. We couldn't use it even if we had it. Too dangerous, too traceable. But the fear that it might be compromised, the chaos that fear generates, the resources that get diverted to protecting something that was never actually threatened, that's useful." Watson stared at the man, trying to process what he was hearing. "You're saying this entire affair was a feint, a distraction?" "I'm saying that sometimes the game is more important than the goal, Doctor. Sometimes the purpose of an attack is not to succeed, but to provoke a defense, to make your opponent reveal their strategies and capabilities. and in that regard, this morning has been quite successful. He tipped his hat slightly. Please give my regards to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Tell him he's every bit as clever as his reputation suggests, which is why we chose him for this exercise. And tell Mr. Mycroft Holmes that his hat will be returned to him shortly, thoroughly examined, I'm afraid, but undamaged. Wait, Watson said as the man turned to leave. Who are you? Who do you work for? The man paused, looking back over his shoulder. Let's just say I work for people who are very interested in Britain's continued security, Doctor. People who believe that the best way to maintain that security is to constantly test it, to expose weaknesses before genuine enemies can exploit them. Your government has many watchers, many protectors. I'm simply one who operates from the shadows rather than the light. And with that, he was gone, disappearing through one of the courtyard exits with a speed that suggested intimate knowledge of these streets and their escape routes. Watson took 2 steps after him, then stopped, recognizing the futility of pursuit in this warren of lanes and courtyards, where a man who knew his way could vanish like smoke. He stood alone in the courtyard, the sounds of the river and the city muffled by the surrounding buildings, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Had the man been telling the truth? Was this entire affair really just an elaborate test, a way of probing the government's security measures? Or was that itself another layer of deception, a story designed to make them lower their guard while the real attack came from another direction entirely? Watson made his way back toward the river, toward more populated streets where he could hail a cab back to Baker Street. His mind churned with questions, with doubts, with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just been played in a game whose rules he didn't fully understand. Sherlock would know what to make of it, he told himself. Sherlock would see through the layers of deception to whatever truth lay beneath. He found a cab on Borough High Street and gave the driver the Baker Street address, settling into the seat with a weariness that was more mental than physical. Through the window, London rolled past in its infinite variety, rich and poor, ancient and modern, familiar and strange all at once. How many other games were being played in these streets? How many other watchers? And watched, hunters and hunted, truth-tellers and liars moved through the crowd, each pursuing their own purposes, each convinced they understood the rules. Baker Street was a relief, solid and familiar, with Mrs. Hudson's predictable concern and the sitting room's unchanged comfort. Sherlock wasn't there yet, but Watson hadn't expected him to be. Following the man in the brown coat might take considerably longer, depending on where he led. Watson built up the fire, more for the comfort than the warmth, and sat down to wait, reviewing the conversation in the courtyard over and over, looking for clues he might have missed, for tells that would indicate truth or lies. The man had been confident, certainly, but was that the confidence of someone telling the truth, or simply the confidence of a skilled liar? An hour passed, then another. The afternoon light began to fade, that early autumn twilight that came sooner each day, reminding London that winter was approaching, that the brief brightness of summer was already a memory. Watson made tea, drank it, made more, still no Sherlock. By the time his friend finally arrived, full darkness had fallen, and the gas lamps were lit, turning Baker Street into a corridor of golden pools separated by shadows. Sherlock burst through the door with characteristic energy, his eyes bright with triumph. "Watson, Excellent. You're back. I've had the most productive afternoon. The man in the brown coat led me on quite a chase, but eventually he met with two others, and from their conversation, which I managed to overhear through a conveniently open window, I learned that the entire morning was orchestrated as a test of our surveillance capabilities. They wanted to see how we'd react, where we'd position our people, how quickly we could mobilize. Rather clever, actually, though I'm somewhat annoyed it took me this long to realize it. Did you have any luck with your quarry? Watson smiled despite himself. Yes, he said. He told me exactly the same thing, though I have to say, he made it sound rather more convincing than you just did. Sherlock stopped in the act of removing his coat, his expression shifting from triumph to concern. He spoke to you? Directly? Watson recounted the conversation in the courtyard, leaving out nothing, watching Sherlock's face as he processed the information. When he finished, Sherlock was silent for a long moment, standing by the fire, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of deep concentration. It's possible, Sherlock said finally. Everything he told you is possible. The British government does employ people to test its own security, to probe for weaknesses before enemies can exploit them. It's called red teaming in military circles, and the story he told has a certain internal consistency, a logic that's almost persuasive. But, Watson prompted, but it's also exactly the kind of story a genuine spy would tell if caught. A way to explain away suspicious behavior, to make the observer doubt their own conclusions, to introduce uncertainty where there was conviction. Sherlock began to pace. The question is, which is it? A genuine security test or a cover story? And how do we determine the truth when both possibilities are equally plausible? We could ask Mycroft, Watson suggested. Surely he would know if his own people were testing security in this manner. Unless the test includes seeing how Mycroft responds when he doesn't know it's a test. These things can get quite baroque, Watson. Wheels within wheels, tests within tests, each level unaware of the others. Sherlock stopped pacing and turned to face Watson directly. What was your impression of the man? Your instinct, not your analysis. Did you believe him? Watson considered the question carefully. I'm not sure, he admitted. He was convincing. But then, the best liars always are. What I can tell you is that he wasn't afraid of me, which suggests either innocence or a very strong position. And he seemed genuinely amused by the whole affair, as though we were all players in a game that he found entertaining. Amused? Sherlock repeated softly. Yes, that's interesting. Genuine spies are rarely amused when caught. They're frightened, or defiant, or desperate. But someone conducting a sanctioned test might indeed find the situation entertaining, might appreciate the complexity of the game they're playing. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram, which she handed to Sherlock with the resigned expression of someone who had long ago accepted that normal dinner hours were impossible in this household. Sherlock tore it open, read it quickly, and his expression darkened. Mycroft, he said. The meeting at the Foreign Office was genuine. A real crisis requiring his immediate attention. Not a setup, not part of any test, which means someone else engineered his early departure from the Diogenes Club. Or it was simply coincidence, Watson suggested. I don't believe in coincidences of that magnitude, Watson, not on a day when everything else appears to be orchestrated. Sherlock crumpled the telegram and tossed it into the fire, watching as it flared and blackened. We're missing something. Some piece of information that would make sense of all this. The hat is still missing. Jenkins is still in custody. The Admiralty report is still potentially compromised. But we're no closer to understanding what actually happened or who's actually responsible. Watson moved to stand beside his friend, both of them staring into the fire as though it might contain answers written in the flames. What do we do now? Now, Sherlock said, we wait and we think. And we try to see the pattern beneath the pattern, the truth beneath the lies. Because somewhere in all this confusion, someone is getting exactly what they want. And until we understand what that is, we're simply pieces on a board, being moved by a player we can't see. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. And outside, London continued its eternal business, indifferent to the small dramas of secrets and suspicions that played out in its countless rooms and streets, caring only for its own vast, inexorable continuation. Watson thought about the man in the courtyard, about his confidence and his amusement, about the envelope full of agricultural statistics that might mean everything or nothing. He thought about hats and tests and games within games. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether the truth was something that could ever be fully known, or whether some mysteries were designed to remain forever mysterious, forever just beyond the reach of even the cleverest detective. Tea, he suggested finally, because sometimes the only response to uncertainty was the certainty of ritual, the comfort of familiar gestures. Yes, Sherlock said. Tea. And then we think some more. Because this isn't over, Watson. Whatever this is, it's not over yet. Saturday arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind that made London forget, for a few precious hours, that autumn was deepening into winter's approach. The light streamed through the windows of 220B Baker Street, with almost aggressive cheerfulness, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air and lending everything a clarity that felt almost accusatory, as though the sunshine itself were demanding answers that neither Sherlock nor Watson could yet provide. They had worked through much of Friday evening, mapping connections, reviewing testimonies, attempting to construct a coherent narrative from the fragments they'd gathered. The sitting room bore evidence of their efforts. Papers spread across every surface, notes pinned to the walls, diagrams sketching out the various possibilities and counter-possibilities that the affair of the missing hat had generated. Mrs. Hudson had brought food at intervals, which they'd consumed without tasting, and had finally retired with the patient resignation of a woman who knew that some nights simply required surrender to chaos. Watson had dozed in his chair around 3 a.m, waking at dawn to find Sherlock still awake, still pacing, still turning the problem over and over like a Rubik's Cube that refused to align properly. Now, with Saturday morning sunshine filling the room and making their exhaustion more obvious, they faced the uncomfortable reality that they were no closer to understanding what had actually occurred than they'd been when Mycroft first burst through their door 2 days ago. "Coffee?" Sherlock announced, with the air of a man making an executive decision. "Strong coffee, a proper breakfast, and then we approach this fresh. We're missing something obvious, Watson, and we're missing it because we're too tired to see it." Mrs. Hudson, summoned by the bell, appeared with a breakfast that suggested she'd been preparing it in anticipation of exactly this moment. Eggs and bacon, toast and marmalade, coffee so strong it was almost militant in its potency. She cleared a space on the table with practiced efficiency, removing yesterday's newspapers and several pages of Sherlock's notes, clucking softly at the state of the room, but saying nothing directly critical, which was her way of expressing profound disapproval. They ate in silence, the food working its restorative magic, the coffee clearing the fog of exhaustion from their minds. Through the window, London went about its Saturday business, shopkeepers opening their establishments, families out for morning constitutionals, street vendors calling their wares, with voices that had been calling the same wares in the same way for generations. The normalcy of it was almost jarring after the convolutions of the past 2 days. "Right then," Sherlock said, pushing his empty plate aside and reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. "Let's approach this systematically. What do we know with absolute certainty? Not supposition, not theory. Facts." Watson settled back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. Mycroft's hat was stolen from the Diogenes Club on Thursday afternoon. "Fact," Sherlock agreed, writing it down. What else? It was replaced with a nearly identical hat, suggesting the theft was meant to go unnoticed, at least initially. Fact. Continue. Martin Jenkins, a Foreign Office courier, admitted to making the switch under coercion. He was being blackmailed by parties unknown to perform various tasks, including the hat switch. Fact. Jenkins is currently in protective custody and has provided us with considerable information about his activities, though notably not about the identities of those who coerced him. Watson frowned. Can't he identify them? Surely he must have met with them, received instructions somehow. Always through intermediaries or anonymous notes, according to his testimony. Very careful, very cautious. They never exposed themselves directly. Sherlock tapped his pen against the paper. What else? The man I followed yesterday claimed the entire affair was a security test, designed to probe the government's counterintelligence capabilities. Claimed, yes, but is that fact or supposition? Supposition, Watson admitted, though he was convincing. The best lies always are. Sherlock added it to the list anyway, marking it with a question mark. Now, what about the hat itself? What do we know about its current location? As if in answer to his question, there came a knock at the door. Not Mrs. Hudson's familiar tap, but something more formal, more official. Both men looked up as Mrs. Hudson showed in a messenger in the distinctive uniform of the Government Postal Service, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper and string. "Delivery for Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the messenger announced. "Sign here, please, sir." Sherlock signed, accepted the package, and saw the messenger out with a coin that earned a surprised expression and a grateful bow. Then he returned to the table and unwrapped the package with careful deliberation, peeling away the layers of paper to reveal. Mycroft's hat, Watson breathed. It was indeed the hat that had gone missing, identifiable by the small repair on the inner band that Mycroft had mentioned, by the particular curve of its brim, by a dozen small details that distinguished it from its substitute. It sat on the table between them like a returned prodigal, unremarkable, and yet, suddenly, the most important object in the room. A note accompanied it, written on plain paper in a neat, anonymous hand. With compliments and apologies for the inconvenience. The examination has been completed and found satisfactory. Please assure Mr. M. Holmes that his routines, while admirable in their consistency, would benefit from occasional variation. Consider this a friendly warning from those who wish him well. Sherlock read the note aloud, then set it aside and began examining the hat with minute attention, turning it over and over, checking the lining, the band, every stitch and seam. Watson watched, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the revelation that would surely come. "Nothing," Sherlock said finally, his voice flat with frustration. "No hidden compartment, no cipher tucked into the lining, no marks or tears or alterations. It's exactly as it should be. A gentleman's hat, worn regularly, maintained adequately, entirely ordinary." "But the note," Watson said. "That's essentially an admission that it was a test, isn't it? A warning about security, rather than an actual theft." "Perhaps." Sherlock picked up the note again, holding it to the light, examining the paper, the ink, the handwriting. Government stationery, standard issue. Ink that could come from 1,000 different pens. Handwriting that's been deliberately neutralized, no distinctive features, no personal quirks. Whoever wrote this took care to leave no trail. A second knock at the door brought Mycroft himself, arriving without his usual preliminary warning, his expression suggesting he'd received his own notification of the hat's return. He entered, saw the hat on the table, and stopped short, staring at it as though it were a ghost materialized from memory. "It came back," he said unnecessarily. 30 minutes ago, Sherlock confirmed, with a note that's either a confession or another layer of deception, depending on how paranoid one wishes to be. Mycroft picked up his hat, with the gentle care of someone reuniting with an old friend, examining it, much as Sherlock had done, looking for changes or damages. Finally, satisfied that it was intact, he set it back down and moved to the chair by the fire, settling into it with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his considerable frame. "I've spent the last 18 hours, he said, conducting the most discreet inquiries possible into whether anyone in the government authorized a security test of the kind that's been suggested. I've spoken with people at levels that officially don't exist, asking questions that officially can't be asked. And the answer, insofar as I can determine, is no. No authorized test, no sanctioned probe, no official exercise that would explain what occurred." "Which means," Watson prompted, "which means either the test was so secret that even I don't have clearance to know about it, which seems unlikely given my position, or the entire story is a fabrication designed to make us doubt ourselves and halt our investigation." Mycroft looked at his brother. "What's your instinct, Sherlock? You've always had better instincts for these things than I have." Sherlock was silent for a long moment, standing by the window with his back to them, looking out at the Saturday sunshine and the peaceful street below. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. "I think," he said slowly, "that we may have been witnessing multiple operations simultaneously, each unaware of the others, each thinking themselves the primary player. I think Jenkins was genuinely coerced and genuinely believed he was working for foreign agents seeking to steal secrets. I think the people who coerced him may indeed have been conducting a security test, using him as an unwitting tool. And I think there may be a third party, perhaps even a fourth, who saw the entire affair as an opportunity to achieve their own goals, whatever those might be." "That's remarkably unsatisfying," Watson said. "Truth often is." Sherlock turned from the window. "Consider, Jenkins is told to switch the hats and believes he's facilitating espionage. But the people directing him are actually testing security protocols. Meanwhile, someone else, the man you encountered, Watson, is watching the Watchers, gathering intelligence on counter-intelligence capabilities. And perhaps someone else entirely is using the chaos and confusion to achieve something we haven't even identified yet. Mycroft nodded slowly. Wheels within wheels. Yes, that has the ring of truth to it. The intelligence world is never simple, never straightforward. Everyone is playing multiple games simultaneously, and most of them don't realize the others are playing too. But the Admiralty report, Watson asked. Was that ever actually at risk? No, Mycroft said with certainty. Or at least, not through this particular vector. Which doesn't mean it's not at risk through other means. But that's a different concern for a different day. He picked up his hat again, turning it in his hands. So what have we actually accomplished? We've identified a courier who was compromised, though the network that compromised him remains largely mysterious. We've exposed some of our own surveillance capabilities to parties unknown, and we've recovered my hat, slightly delayed, but undamaged. We've learned something more important than that, Sherlock said. We've learned that your routine is exploitable, that your predictability is a vulnerability. The note wasn't wrong about that, brother. You need to vary your patterns, change your habits, become less knowable. Mycroft looked pained at the suggestion. I like my patterns. They're efficient. They allow me to minimize wasted time and mental effort on trivial decisions. They also make you a target, not just for theft, but for surveillance, for manipulation, for all manner of exploitations. The world is changing, Mycroft. The old certainties are breaking down. The war that's coming. What war? Watson interjected sharply. Sherlock waved a hand dismissively. The war that's always coming, that everyone who pays attention can see gathering on the horizon like a storm. The balance of power in Europe is unstable. The alliances are fragile. The arms race is accelerating. Within 10 years, perhaps 20, there will be a conflict that makes the Crimean War look like a border skirmish. And when it comes, information will be as important as ammunition. People like Mycroft will be targets. People who maintain rigid patterns will be vulnerable. The room fell silent, the weight of this prediction settling over them like a cloud obscuring the sunshine. Watson thought about the war he'd already fought, about Afghanistan and the wound that still ached on damp days. He thought about the young men who would fight the next war, who would die in ways that couldn't yet be imagined. And he thought about how a missing hat could be, in its own small way, a warning of larger storms to come. So what happens to Jenkins? Watson asked, trying to return to more immediate concerns. He'll be relocated, Mycroft said. New position, new city, possibly even a new identity. He made mistakes, but he was coerced, and he cooperated fully once discovered. He deserves a second chance, though his days of handling sensitive material are over. And the people who coerced him will be watched, tracked, and eventually identified. These things take time, but we're patient. The network may think they've succeeded in testing our security, but in doing so, they've revealed patterns of their own, methods and approaches that we can now anticipate and counter. Mycroft stood, picking up his hat with finality. I should go. I have several appointments this afternoon, and if I'm to start varying my routine, I suppose I should begin immediately. Where do you usually go on Saturday afternoons? Sherlock asked. The British Museum, to review their collection of ancient manuscripts. I find it relaxing. Then go somewhere else. Take a different route. Wear a different hat. Sherlock smiled slightly. Live dangerously, brother. Mycroft snorted, but there was affection in it. I'll take your advice under consideration. Thank you both for your assistance in this matter. Even if the resolution is less satisfying than one might hope, at least I have my hat back. And we have a better understanding of the shadows in which we all live, Sherlock added. After Mycroft departed, Watson and Sherlock set about restoring order to the sitting room, gathering up the scattered papers, taking down the notes from the walls, returning their space to something approaching normalcy. It was companionable work, requiring little conversation, and Watson found himself grateful for the simple domesticity of it after the complexities of the past 2 days. "Do you really believe we'll see war in our lifetimes?" Watson asked as they worked. "I think it's inevitable," Sherlock said. "Too many nations with too many interests competing for too few resources. Add in nationalism and industrial capacity and the sheer momentum of historical forces, and yes, I think war is coming. But that's a concern for another day, Watson. Today, we've solved the mystery of the missing hat, more or less, and that's enough. Have we solved it, though? It feels more like we've catalogued our ignorance." Sherlock laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. "That, my dear Watson, is the definition of wisdom, knowing the extent of what you don't know. Most people never achieve even that much clarity." They finished tidying, and Mrs. Hudson brought tea, proper afternoon tea with sandwiches and cakes, a civilized ritual to mark the return to normalcy. They sat by the fire, despite the sunshine making it unnecessary, simply because it felt right, because the fire was as much a part of their space as the chairs, or the books, or the violin that sat silent in its case. "You know," Watson said, "when Mycroft first came bursting through that door, so agitated about his missing hat, I thought it was almost comical. A hat, of all things. Such a trivial concern for a man who helps run an empire." "But it wasn't trivial, was it?" Sherlock replied. "That's what we've learned. Nothing is trivial when it's examined closely enough. A hat can be a message system, a security test, a vulnerability, a warning. The smallest things contain infinite complexity if you know how to look at them. Rather like people, I suppose." "Exactly like people." Sherlock sipped his tea, gazing into the fire. "Take Jenkins, for instance. A minor courier, seemingly insignificant, but containing within himself a whole universe of motivations and fears and loyalties. His sister and her children, depending on him. His career, precariously balanced. His honor, compromised but not entirely lost. All of that contained in one unremarkable young man whom most people would pass in the street without a second glance." Watson thought about this, about the complexity hidden in apparent simplicity, about how much remained unknown even when you thought you'd found answers. We live in a world of mysteries, don't we? We do, and perhaps that's not such a bad thing. Certainty can be comfortable, but it's also limiting. Mystery keeps us curious, keeps us engaged, keeps us questioning. The day we stop encountering mysteries is the day we stop truly living. The fire crackled in agreement, or perhaps just because that's what fires do. Outside, London continued its eternal Saturday, indifferent to their philosophical musings, caring only for its own vast, inexhaustible existence. Somewhere in the city, Jenkins sat in his safe house, contemplating his second chance. Somewhere, the man in the brown coat went about his business, whatever that business truly was. Somewhere, Mycroft varied his routine or didn't, maintained his patterns or broke them. And in 221B Baker Street, two men sat by the fire and drank their tea and were content, for the moment, to let the mysteries of the world remain mysterious, to let the unanswered questions stay unanswered, to simply exist in the comfortable space they'd created together over years of friendship and adventure. "You know what the real mystery is," Watson said suddenly. "What's that?" "How Mrs. Hudson always knows exactly when to. Bring tea. It's uncanny." Sherlock smiled. "Some mysteries, Watson, are best left unsolved. The magic only works if you don't examine it too closely." And so they sat, as the afternoon light slowly shifted toward evening, as the fire burned lower and the tea grew cold, as London moved around them in its infinite complexity and infinite simplicity, and they were content to be exactly where they were, doing exactly what they were doing, which was nothing more or less than keeping each other company at the end of a strange and puzzling week. The hat sat on the table, where Mycroft had left it, a small monument to the adventure that had been, and the questions that remained. Tomorrow, perhaps, they would examine it more closely, look for clues they'd missed, try once more to understand what had really occurred. Or perhaps they wouldn't. Perhaps they'd simply let it be what it appeared to be. A hat, returned to its owner, a mystery concluded, if not entirely solved. Outside, a street vendor called his wares. A child laughed, a dog barked. London lived and breathed and continued, as it always had, as it always would, indifferent to the small dramas of its inhabitants, caring only for its own continuation, its own eternal story, of which this afternoon, this room, these two men were the smallest and most insignificant part. And yet, Watson thought, perhaps not so insignificant after all. Perhaps every part mattered, every moment counted, every mystery contained within it some essential truth about the world and their place in it. Oh, the fire sighed and settled. The clock ticked, and in the warm, comfortable silence of 221B Baker Street, two friends shared tea and contemplated mysteries, which is perhaps all any of us can hope to do in this vast, unknowable world. The end of the case of the missing hat, and the beginning, as always, of whatever would come next. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our tale. A hat was lost and found, secrets were pursued and remained elusive, and London continued its eternal dance of light and shadow, of truth and mystery. Perhaps you're drifting now, your own thoughts softening into dreams, the day's concerns fading like fog in morning sun. That's as it should be. Rest now, knowing that even the smallest mysteries have their resolution, even if that resolution is simply acceptance of what remains unknown. Until next time, sleep well, dream gently, and may your own mysteries be kind ones. Good night.